Robert Turner's Revenge. When Robert Turner came to the green, ferny triangle where the station road forked to the right and left under the birches, he hesitated as to which direction he would take. The left led out to the old Turner homestead, where he had spent his boyhood, and where his cousins still lived. The right led down to the cove shore, where the Jameson property was situated. Since he had stopped off at Chiswick for the purpose of looking this property over before foreclosing the mortgage on it, he concluded that he might as well take the cove road. He could go around by the shore afterward. He had not forgotten the way even in 40 years, and so on up through the old spruce wood in Alec Martin's field, if the spruces were there still and the field still Alec Martin's, to his cousin's place. He would just about have time to make the round before the early country supper hour. Then a brief visit with Tom. Tom had always been a good sort of a fellow, although woefully dull and slow going, and the evening express for Montreal. He swung with a businesslike stride into the cove road. As he went on, however, the stride insensibly slackened into an unaccustomed saunter. How well he remembered that old road, although it was 40 years since he had last traversed it. A set-lipped boy of 15, cast on the world by the indifference of an uncle. The years had made surprisingly little difference in it or in the surrounding scenery. True, the hills and fields and lanes seemed lower and smaller and narrower than he remembered them. There were some new houses along the road, and the belt of woods along the back of the farms had become thinner in most places. But that was all. He had no difficulty in picking out the old familiar spots. There was the big cherry orchard on the Milligan place, which had been so famous in his boyhood. It was snow white with blossoms, as if the trees were possessed of eternal youth. They had been in blossom the last time he had seen them. Well, time had not stood still with him as it had with Luke Milligan's cherry orchard, he reflected grimly. His springtime had long gone by. The few people he met on the road looked at him curiously, for strangers were not commonplace in Chiswick. He recognized some of the older among them, but none of them knew him. He had been an awkward, long-limbed lad, with fresh boyish colour and crisp black curls when he had left Chiswick. He returned to it a somewhat portly figure of a man, with close-cropped grizzled hair and a face that looked as if it might be carved out of granite. So immobile and unyielding it was, the face of a man who never faltered or wavered, who stuck at nothing that might advance his plans and purposes. A face known and dreaded in the business world where he reigned master. It was a cold, hard, selfish face. But the face of the boy of 40 years ago had been neither cold, nor hard, nor selfish. Presently the homesteads and orchard lands grew fewer and then ceased altogether. The fields were long and low-lying, sloping down to the misty blue rim of sea. A turn of the road brought him in sudden sight of the cove, and there below him was the old Jameson homestead, built almost within wave-lap of the pebbly shore and shut away into a lonely grey world of its own by the sea and sands and those long slopes of tenantless fields. He paused at the sagging gate that opened into the long, deep-rutted lane, and folding his arms on it, looked earnestly and scrutinizingly over the buildings. They were grey and faded, lacking the prosperous appearance that had characterized them once. There was an air of failure about the whole place, as if the very land had become disheartened and discouraged. Long ago Neil Jameson Senior had been a well-to-do man. The Big Cove farm had been one of the best in Chiswick then. As for Neil Jameson Junior, Robert Turner's face always grew something grimmer when he recalled him, the one person, boy and man, whom he had really hated in the world. They had been enemies from childhood, and once in a bout of wrestling at the Chiswick school Neil had thrown him by an unfair trick, and taunted him continually thereafter on his defeat. Robert had made a compact with himself that some day he would pay Neil Jameson back. He had not forgotten it. He never forgot such things. But he had never seen or heard of Neil Jameson after leaving Chiswick. He might have been dead for anything Robert Turner knew. Then, when John Kesley failed and his effects turned over to his creditors, of whom Robert Turner was the chief, a mortgage on the Cove farm at Chiswick, owned by Neil Jameson, had been found among his assets. Inquiry revealed the fact that Neil Jameson was dead, and that the farm was run by his widow. Turner felt a pang of disappointment. What satisfaction was there in wreaking revenge on a dead man? But at least his wife and children should suffer. That debt of his to Jameson for an ill-won victory, and many a sneer must be paid in full. If not to him, why, then to his heirs. His lawyers reported that Mrs. Jameson was 2 years behind with her interest. Turner instructed them to foreclose the mortgage promptly. Then he took it into his head to revisit Chiswick and have a good look at the Cove farm and other places he knew so well. He had a notion that it might be a decent place to spend a summer month or two in. His wife went to seaside and mountain resorts, but he liked something quieter. There was good fishing at the Cove and in Chiswick Pond, as he remembered. If he liked the farm as well as his memory promised him he would do, he would bid it in himself. It would make Neil Jameson turn in his grave if the penniless lad he had jeered at came into the possession of his old ancestral property that had been owned by a Jameson for over 100 years. There was a flavour in such a revenge that pleased Robert Turner. He smiled one of his occasional grim smiles over it. When Robert Turner smiled, weather prophets of the business sky foretold squalls. Presently he opened the gate and went through. Halfway down the lane forked, one branch going over to the house, the other slanting across the field to the Cove. Turner took the latter and soon found himself on the grey shore where the waves were tumbling in creamy foam just as he remembered them long ago. Nothing about the old Cove had changed. He walked around a knobby headland, weather-worn with the wind and spray of years, which cut him off from sight of the Jameson house, and sat down on a rock. He thought himself alone, and was annoyed to find a boy sitting on the opposite ledge with a book on his knee. The lad lifted his eyes and looked Turner over with a clear, direct gaze. He was about 12 years old, tall for his age, slight, with a delicate, clear-cut face, a face that was oddly familiar to Turner, although he was sure he had never seen it before. The boy had oval cheeks, finely tinted with colour, big, shy blue eyes, quilled with long black lashes, and silvery golden hair lying over his head in soft ringlets like a girl's. What girl's? Something far back in Robert Turner's dreamlike boyhood seemed to call to him like a note of a forgotten melody, sweet yet stirring like a pain. The more he looked at the boy, the stronger the impression of a resemblance grew in every feature but the mouth. That was alien to his recollection of the face, yet there was something about it, when taken by itself, that seemed oddly familiar. Also, yes, and unpleasantly familiar, although the mouth was a good one, finely cut and possessing more firmness than was found in all the other features put together. "It's a good place for reading, Sonny, isn't it?" he inquired, more genially than he had spoken to a child for years. In fact, having no children of his own, he so seldom spoke to a child that his voice and manner when he did so were generally awkward and rusty. The boy nodded a quick little nod. Somehow Turner had expected that nod and the glimmer of a smile that accompanied it. "What book are you reading?" he asked. The boy held it out. It was an old Robinson Crusoe, that classic of boyhood. "It's splendid," he said. "Billy Martin lent it to me, and I have to finish it today because Ned Josephs is to have it next, and he's in a hurry for it." "It's a good while since I read Robinson Crusoe," said Turner reflectively. "But when I did, it was on this very shore a little further along below the Miller place. There was a Martin and a Josephs in the partnership then, too. The fathers, I dare say, of Billy and Ned. What's your name, my boy?" "Paul Jameson, sir." The name was a shock to Turner. This boy a Jameson, Neil Jameson's son. Why, yes, he had Neil's mouth. Strange he had nothing else in common with the black-browed, black-haired Jamesons. What business had a Jameson with those blue eyes and silvery golden curls? It was flagrant forgery on Nature's part to fashion such things and label them Jameson by a mouth. Hated Neil Jameson's son. Robert Turner's face grew so gray and hard that the boy involuntarily glanced upward to see if a cloud had crossed the sun. "Your father was Neil Jameson, I suppose?" Turner said abruptly. Paul nodded. "Yes, but he is dead. He has been dead for 8 years. I don't remember him." "Have you any brothers or sisters?" "I have a little sister, a year younger than I am. The other 4 are dead. They died long ago. I'm the only boy Mother had. Oh, I do so wish I was bigger and older. If I was, I could do something to save the place. I'm sure I could. It is breaking Mother's heart to have to leave it." "So she has to leave it, has she?" said Turner grimly, with the old hatred stirring in his heart. Yes, there's a mortgage on it, and we're to be sold out very soon, so the lawyers told us. Mother's tried so hard to make the farm pay, but she couldn't. I could if I was bigger. I know I could. If they'd only wait a few years, but there's no use hoping for that. Mother cries all the time about it. She has lived at the Cove farm for over 30 years, and she says she can't live away from it now. Elsie, that's my sister, and I do all we can to cheer her up, but we can't do much. Oh, if I was only a man!" The lad shut his lips together. How much his mouth was like his father's, and looked out seaward with troubled blue eyes. Turner smiled another grim smile. "Oh, Neil Jameson, your old score was being paid now." Yet something embittered the sweetness of revenge. That boy's face, he could not hate it as he had accustomed himself to hate the memory of Neil Jameson and all connected with him. "What was your mother's name before she married your father?" he demanded abruptly. "Lisbeth Miller," answered the boy, still frowning seaward over his secret thoughts. Turner started again. Lisbeth Miller! He might have known it. What woman in all the world save Elizabeth Miller could have given her son those eyes and curls? So Lisbeth had married Neil Jameson. Little Lisbeth Miller, his schoolboy sweetheart. He had forgotten her, or thought he had. Certainly he had not thought of her for years, but the memory of her came back now with a rush. Little Lisbeth, pretty little Lisbeth, merry little Lisbeth. How clearly he remembered her. The old Miller place had adjoined his uncle's farm. Lisbeth and he had played together from babyhood. How he had worshipped her! When they were 6 years old they had solemnly promised to marry each other when they grew up, and Lisbeth had let him kiss her as earnest of their compact, made under a bloom-white apple tree in the Miller orchard. Yet she would always blush furiously and deny it ever afterwards. It made her angry to be reminded of it. He saw himself going to school, carrying her books for her, the envy of all the boys. He remembered how he had fought Tony Josephs because Tony had the presumption to bring her spice apples. He had thrashed him too, so soundly that from that time forth none of the schoolboys presumed to rival him in Lisbeth's affections. Roguish little Lisbeth, you grew prettier and saucier every year. He recalled the keen competition of the old days, when to be head of the class seemed the highest honour within mortal reach, and was striven after with might and main. He had seldom attained to it because he would never go up past Elizabeth. If she missed a word, he, Robert, missed it too, no matter how well he knew it. It was sweet to be thought a dunce for her dear sake. It was all the reward he asked to see her holding her place at the head of the class, her cheeks flushed pink and her eyes starry with her pride of position. And how sweetly she would lecture him on the way home from school about learning his spellings better, and wind up her sermon with the frank avowal, uttered with deliciously downcast lids, that she liked him better than any of the other boys after all, even if he couldn't spell as well as they could. Nothing of success that he had won since had ever thrilled him as that admission of little Lisbeth's. She had been such a sympathetic little sweetheart too, never weary of listening to his dreams and ambitions, his plans for the future. She had always assured him that she knew he would succeed. Well, he had succeeded, and now one of the uses he was going to make of his success was to turn Lisbeth and her children out of their home by way of squaring matters with a dead man. Lisbeth had been away from home on a long visit to an aunt when he had left Chiswick. She was growing up, and the childish intimacy was fading. Perhaps under other circumstances it might have ripened into fruit, but he had gone away and forgotten her. The world had claimed him. He had lost all active remembrance of Lisbeth, and before this late return to Chiswick he had not even known if she were living. And she was Neil Jameson's widow. He was silent for a long time, while the waves purred about the base of the big red sandstone rock, and the boy returned to his Crusoe. Finally Robert Turner roused himself from his reverie. "I used to know your mother long ago, when she was a little girl," he said. "I wonder if she remembers me. Ask her when you go home if she remembers Bobby Turner." "Won't you come up to the house and see her, sir?" asked Paul politely. "Mother's always glad to see her old friends." "No, I haven't time today." Robert Turner was not going to tell Neil Jameson's son that he did not care to look for the little Lisbeth of long ago in Neil Jameson's widow. The name spoiled her for him, just as the Jameson mouse spoiled her son for him. "But you may tell her something else. The mortgage will not be foreclosed. I was the power behind the lawyers, but I did not know that the present owner of the Cove farm was my little playmate, Lisbeth Miller. You and she shall have all the time you want. Tell her Bobby Turner does this in return for what she gave him under the big sweeting apple tree on her 6th birthday. I think she will remember and understand. As for you, Paul, be a good boy and good to your mother. I hope you'll succeed in your ambition of making the farm pay when you're old enough to take it in hand. At any rate, you'll not be disturbed in your possession of it." "Oh, sir! Oh, sir!" stammered Paul in an agony of embarrassed gratitude and delight. "Oh, it seems too good to be true. Do you really mean that we're not to be sold out? Oh, won't you come and tell Mother yourself? She'll be so happy, so grateful. Do come and let her thank you." "Not today. I haven't time. Give her my message, that's all. There, run. The sooner she gets the news, the better." Turner watched the boy as he bounded away until the headland hid him from sight. "There goes my revenge, and a fine bit of property eminently suited for a summer residence. All for a bit of old, rusty sentiment," he said with a shrug. "I didn't suppose I was capable of such a mood. But then, little Lisbeth! There never was a sweeter girl. I'm glad I didn't go with the boy to see her. She's an old woman now, and Neil Jameson's widow. I prefer to keep my old memories of her undisturbed. Little Lisbeth of the silvery golden curls and the roguish blue eyes. Little Lisbeth of the old time. I'm glad to be able to have done you the small service of securing your home to you. It is my thanks to you for the friendship and affection you gave my lonely boyhood, my tribute to the memory of my first sweetheart." He walked away with a smile, whose amusement presently softened to an expression that would have amazed his business cronies. Later on he hummed the air of an old love song as he climbed the steep spruce road to Tom's. End of Robert Turner's Revenge. The Fillmore Elderberries. "I expected as much," said Timothy Robinson. His tone brought the blood into Ellis Duncan's face. The lad opened his lips quickly, as if for an angry retort, but as quickly closed them again, with a set firmness oddly like Timothy Robinson's own. "When I heard that lazy, worthless father of yours was dead, I expected you and your mother would be looking to me for help," Timothy Robinson went on harshly. "But you're mistaken if you think I'll give it. You've no claim on me, even if your father was my half brother. No claim at all. And I'm not noted for charity." Timothy Robinson smiled grimly. It was very true that he was far from being noted for charity. His neighbours called him close and near, Some even went as far as to call him a miserly skinflint, but this was not true. It was, however, undeniable that Timothy Robinson kept a tight clutch on his purse strings, and although he sometimes gave liberally enough to any cause which really appealed to him, such causes were few and far between. "I'm not asking for charity, Uncle Timothy," said Ellis quietly. He passed over the slur at his father in silence, deeply as he felt it, for alas, he knew that it was only too true. "I expect to support my mother by hard and honest work, and I'm not asking you for work on the ground of our relationship. I heard you wanted a hired man, and I have come to you, as I should have gone to any other man about whom I had heard it, to ask you to hire me." "Yes, I do want a man," said Uncle Timothy dryly. "A man, not a half-grown boy of 14, not worth his salt. I want somebody able and willing to work." Again Ellis flushed deeply, and again he controlled himself. "I am willing to work, Uncle Timothy, and I think you would find me able also if you would try me. I'd work for less than a man's wage at first, of course." "You won't work for any sort of wages from me," interrupted Timothy Robinson decidedly. "I tell you plainly that I won't hire you. You're the wrong man's son for that. Your father was lazy and incompetent, and worst of all, untrustworthy. I did try to help him once, and all I got was loss and ingratitude. I want none of his kind around my place. I don't believe in you, so you may as well take yourself off, Ellis. I've no more time to waste." Ellis took himself off, his ears tingling. As he walked homeward his thoughts were very bitter. All Uncle Timothy had said about his father was true, and Ellis realized what a count it was against him in his efforts to obtain employment. Nobody wanted to be bothered with old Sam Duncan's son, though nobody had been so brutally outspoken as his Uncle Timothy. Sam Duncan and Timothy Robinson had been half brothers. Sam, the older, had been the son of Mrs. Robinson's former marriage. Never were two lads more dissimilar. Sam was a lazy, shiftless fellow, deserving all the hard things that came to be said of him. He would not work, and nobody could depend on him. But he was a handsome lad with rather taking ways in his youth, and at first people had liked him better than the close, blunt, industrious Timothy. Their mother had died in their childhood, but Mr. Robinson had been fond of Sam, and the boy had a good home. When he was 22 and Timothy 18, Mr. Robinson had died very suddenly, leaving no will. Everything he possessed went to Timothy. Sam immediately left. He said he would not stay there to be bossed by Timothy. He rented a little house in the village, married a girl far too good for him, and started in to support himself and his wife by day's work. He had lounged, borrowed, and shirked through life. Once Timothy Robinson, perhaps moved by pity for Sam's wife and baby, had hired him for a year at better wages than most hired men received in Dalrymple. Sam idled through a month of it, then got offended and left in the middle of haying. Timothy Robinson washed his hands of him after that. When Ellis was 14, Sam Duncan died, after a lingering illness of a year. During this time the family were kept by the charity of pitying neighbours, for Ellis could not be spared from attendance on his father to make any attempt at earning money. Mrs. Duncan was a fragile little woman, worn out with her hard life, and not strong enough to wait on her husband alone. When Sam Duncan was dead and buried, Ellis straightened his shoulders and took counsel with himself. He must earn a livelihood for his mother and himself, and he must begin at once. He was tall and strong for his age, and had a fairly good education, his mother having determinedly kept him at school when he had pleaded to be allowed to go to work. He had always been a quiet fellow, and nobody in Dalrymple knew much about him. But they knew all about his father, and nobody would hire Ellis unless he were willing to work for a pittance that would barely clothe them. Ellis had not gone to his Uncle Timothy until he had lost all hope of getting a place elsewhere. Now this hope, too, had gone. It was nearly the end of June, and everybody who wanted help had secured it. Look where he would, Ellis could see no prospect of employment. "If I could only get a chance," he thought miserably. "I know I'm not idle or lazy. I know I can work, if I could get a chance to prove it." He was sitting on the fence of the Fillmore Elderberry pasture as he said it, having taken a short cut across the fields. This pasture was rather noted in Dalrymple. Originally a mellow and fertile field, it had been almost ruined by a persistent, luxuriant growth of elderberry bushes. Old Thomas Fillmore had at first tried to conquer them by mowing them down in the dark of the moon, but the elderberries did not seem to mind either moon or mowing, and flourished alike in all the quarters. For the past 2 years Old Thomas had given up the contest, and the elderberries had it all their own sweet way. Thomas Fillmore, a bent old man with a shrewd nutcracker face, came through the bushes while Ellis was sitting on the fence. "Howdy, Ellis. Seen anything of my spotted calves? I've been looking for 'em for over an hour." "No, I haven't seen any calves, but a good many might be in this pasture without being visible to the naked eye," said Ellis with a smile. Old Thomas shook his head ruefully. "Them elders have been too many for me," he said. "Did you ever see a worse looking place? You'd hardly believe that 20 years ago there wasn't a better piece of land in Dalrymple than this lot, would ye? Such grass as grew here." "The soil must be as good as ever if anything had a chance to grow on it," said Alice. "Couldn't those elders be rooted out?" "It'd be a back-breaking job, but I reckon it could be done if anyone had the muscle and the patience and time to tackle it. I haven't the first at my age, and my hired man hasn't the last, and nobody would do it for what I could afford to pay." "What will you give me if I undertake to clean the elders out of this field for you, Mr. Fillmore?" asked Ellis quietly. Old Thomas looked at him with a surprised face, which gradually reverted to its original shrewdness when he saw that Ellis was in earnest. "You must be hard up for a job," he said. "I am," was Ellis's laconic answer. "Well, let me see." Old Thomas calculated carefully. He never paid a cent more for anything than he could help, and was noted for hard bargaining. "I'll give ye $16 if you clean out the whole field," he said at length. Ellis looked at the pasture. He knew something about cleaning out elderberry brush, and he also knew that $16 would be very poor pay for it. Most of the elders were higher than a man's head, with big roots thicker than his wrist, running deep into the ground. "It's worth more, Mr. Fillmore," he said. "Not to me," responded Old Thomas dryly. "I've plenty more land, and I'm an old fellow without any sons. I ain't going to pay out money for the benefit of some stranger who'll come after me. You can take it or leave it at $16." Ellis shrugged his shoulders. He had no prospect of anything else, and $16 was better than nothing. "Very well, I'll take it," he said. "Well, now, look here," said Old Thomas shrewdly. "I'll expect you to do the work thoroughly, young man. Them roots ain't to be cut off, remember. They'll have to be dug out. And I'll expect you to finish the job if you undertake it, too, and not drop it halfway through if you get a chance for a better one." "I'll finish with your elderberries before I leave 'em," promised Ellis. Ellis went to work the next day. His first move was to chop down all the brush and cart it into heaps for burning. This took 2 days and was comparatively easy work. The third day Ellis tackled the roots. By the end of the forenoon he had discovered just what cleaning out an elderberry pasture meant, but he set his teeth and resolutely persevered. During the afternoon Timothy Robinson, whose farm adjoined the Fillmore place, wandered by and halted with a look of astonishment at the sight of Ellis busily engaged in digging and tearing out huge, tough, stubborn elder roots. The boy did not see his uncle, but worked away with a vim and vigour that were not lost on the latter. "He never got that muscle from Sam," reflected Timothy. "Sam would have fainted at the mere thought of stumping elders. Perhaps I've been mistaken in the boy. Well, we'll see if he holds out." Ellis did hold out. The elderberries tried to hold out too, but they were no match for the lad's perseverance. It was a hard piece of work, however, and Ellis never forgot it. Week after week he toiled in the hot summer sun, digging, cutting, and dragging out roots. The job seemed endless, and his progress each day was discouragingly slow. He had expected to get through it in a month, but he soon found it would take 2. Frequently Timothy Robinson wandered by and looked at the increasing pile of roots and the slowly extending stretch of cleared land, but he never spoke to Ellis and made no comment on the matter to anybody. One evening, when the field was about half done, Ellis went home more than usually tired. It had been a very hot day. Every bone and muscle in him ached. He wondered dismally if he would ever get to the end of that wretched elderberry field. When he reached home Jacob Green from Westdale was there. Jacob lost no time in announcing his errand. "My hired boy's broke his leg, and I must fill his place right off. Somebody referred me to you. Guess I'll try you. $12 a month, board and lodging. What do you say?" For a moment Ellis's face flushed with delight. $12 a month and permanent employment! Then he remembered his promise to Mr. Fillmore. For a moment he struggled with the temptation. Then he mastered it. Perhaps the discipline of his many encounters with those elderberry roots helped him to do so. "I'm sorry, Mr. Green," he said reluctantly. "I'd like to go, but I can't. I promised Mr. Fillmore that I'd finish cleaning up his elderberry pasture when I'd once begun it, and I shan't be through for a month yet." "Well, I'd see myself turning down a good offer for old Tom Fillmore," said Jacob Green. "It isn't for Mr. Fillmore. It's for myself," said Ellis steadily. "I promised, and I must keep my word." Jacob drove away grumblingly. On the road he met Timothy Robinson and stopped to relate his grievances. It must be admitted that there were times during the next month when Ellis was tempted to repent having refused Jacob Green's offer. But at the end of the month the work was done, and the Fillmore elderberry pasture was an elderberry pasture no longer. All that remained of the elders, root and branch, was piled into a huge heap ready for burning. "And I'll come up and set fire to it when it's dry enough," Ellis told Mr. Fillmore. "I claim the satisfaction of that." "You've done the job thoroughly," said Old Thomas. "There's your $16, and every cent of it was earned, if ever money was. I'll say that much for you. There ain't a lazy bone in your body. If you ever want a recommendation, just you come to me." As Ellis passed Timothy Robinson's place on the way home that worthy himself appeared, strolling down his lane. "Ah, Ellis," he said, speaking to his nephew for the first time since their interview 2 months before, "so you've finished with your job?" "Yes, sir." "Got your $16, I suppose? It was worth 4 times that. Old Thomas cheated you. You were foolish not to have gone to Green when you had the chance." "I'd promised Mr. Fillmore to finish with his pasture, sir." "Humph! Well, what are you going to do now?" "I don't know. Harvest will be on next week. I may get in somewhere as an extra hand for a spell." "Ellis," said his uncle abruptly, after a moment's silence, "I'm going to discharge my man. He's no earthly good. Will you take his place? I'll give you $15 a month and found." Ellis stared at Timothy Robinson. "I thought you told me that you had no place for my father's son," he said slowly. "I've changed my mind. I've seen how you went at that elderberry job. Great snakes, there couldn't be a better test for anybody than rooting out them things. I know you can work. When Jacob Green told me why you'd refused his offer, I knew you could be depended on. You come to me and I'll do well by you. I've no kith or kin of my own except you. And look here, Ellis, I'm tired of hired housekeepers. Will your mother come up and live with us and look after things a bit? I've a good girl, and she won't have to work hard. But there must be somebody at the head of the household. She must have a good headpiece, for you have inherited good qualities from someone, and goodness knows it wasn't from your father." "Uncle Timothy," said Ellis respectfully but firmly, "I'll accept your offer gratefully, and I'm sure Mother will too. But there's one thing I must say. Perhaps my father deserves all you say of him, but he is dead, and if I come to you it must be with the understanding that nothing more is ever to be said against him." Timothy Robinson smiled, a queer, twisted smile that yet had a hint of affection and comprehension in it. "Very well," he said. "I'll never cast his shortcomings up to you again. Come to me, and if I find you always as industrious and reliable as you've proved yourself to be negotiating them elders, I'll most likely forget that you ain't my own son some of these days." End of The Fillmore Elderberries. The finished story. She always sat in a corner of the west veranda at the hotel, knitting something white and fluffy, or pink and fluffy, or pale blue and fluffy, always fluffy. at least, and always dainty. Shawls and scarves and hoods the things were, I believe. When she finished one she gave it to some girl and began another. Every girl at Harbour Light that summer wore some distracting thing that had been fashioned by Miss Sylvia's slim, tireless white fingers. She was old, with that beautiful, serene old age which is as beautiful in its way as youth. Her girlhood and womanhood must have been very lovely to have ripened into such a beauty of 60 years. It was a surprise to everyone who heard her called Miss Sylvia. She looked so like a woman who ought to have stalwart grown sons and dimpled little grandchildren. For the first 2 days after the arrival at the hotel she sat in her corner alone. There was always a circle of young people around her. Old folks and middle-aged people would have liked to join it, but Miss Sylvia, while she was gracious to all, let it be distinctly understood that her sympathies were with youth. She sat among the boys and girls, young men and maidens, like a fine white queen. Her dress was always the same and somewhat old-fashioned, but nothing else would have suited her half so well. She wore a lace cap on her snowy hair, with a heliotrope shawl over her black silk shoulders. She knitted continually and talked a good deal, but listened more. We sat around her at all hours of the day and told her everything. When you were first introduced to her, you called her Miss Stanley Main. Her endurance of that was limited to 24 hours. Then she begged you to call her Miss Sylvia, and as Miss Sylvia you spoke and thought of her for evermore. Miss Sylvia liked us all, but I was her favourite. She told us so frankly, and let it be understood that when I was talking to her and her heliotrope shawl was allowed to slip under one arm, it was a sign that we were not to be interrupted. I was as vain of her favour as any lovelorn suitor whose lady had honoured him, not knowing, as I came to know her later, the reason for it. Although Miss Sylvia had an unlimited capacity for receiving confidences, she never gave any. We were all sure that there must be some romance in her life, but our efforts to discover it were unsuccessful. Miss Sylvia parried tentative questions so skilfully that we knew she had something to defend. But one evening, when I had known her a month, as time is reckoned, and long years as affection and understanding are computed, she told me her story, at least what there was to tell of it. The last chapter was missing. We were sitting together on the veranda at sunset. Most of the hotel people had gone for a harbour sail. A few forlorn mortals prowled about the grounds and eyed our corner wistfully, but by the sign of the heliotrope shawl knew it was not for them. I was reading one of my stories to Miss Sylvia. In my own excuse I must allege that she tempted me to do it. I did not go around with manuscripts under my arm inflicting them on defenceless females. But Miss Sylvia had discovered that I was a magazine scribbler, and moreover that I had shut myself up in my room that very morning and perpetrated a short story. Nothing would do but that I read it to her. It was a rather sad little story. The hero loved the heroine and she loved him. There was no reason why he should not love her, but there was a reason why he could not marry her. When he found that he loved her, he knew that he must go away. But might he not at least tell her his love? Might he not at least find out for his consolation if she cared for him? There was a struggle. He won, and went away without a word, believing it to be the more manly course. When I began to read, Miss Sylvia was knitting, a pale green something this time, of the tender hue of young leaves in May. But after a little her knitting slipped unheeded to her lap, and her hands folded idly above it. It was the most subtle compliment I had ever received. When I turned the last page of the manuscript and looked up, Miss Sylvia's soft brown eyes were full of tears. She lifted her hands, clasped them together, and said in an agitated voice, "Oh, no, no. Don't let him go away without telling her. Just telling her. Don't let him do it." "But you see, Miss Sylvia," I explained, flattered beyond measure that my characters had seemed so real to her, "that would spoil the story. It would have no reason for existence then. Its motive is simply his mastery over self. He believes it to be the nobler course." No, no, it wasn't. If he loved her, he should have told her. Think of her shame and humiliation. She loved him, and he went without a word, and she could never know he cared for her. Oh, you must change it, you must indeed. I cannot bear to think of her suffering what I have suffered." Miss Sylvia broke down and sobbed. To appease her, I promised that I would remodel the story, although I knew that the doing so would leave it absolutely pointless. "Oh, I'm so glad," said Miss Sylvia, her eyes shining through her tears. "You see, I know it would make her happier. I know it. I'm going to tell you my poor little story to convince you. But you must not tell it to any of the others." "I am sorry you think the admonition necessary," I said reproachfully. "Oh, I do not. Indeed, I do not," she hastened to assure him. "I know I can trust you. But it's such a poor little story. You mustn't laugh at it. It is all the romance I had. Years ago, 40 years ago, when I was a young girl of 20, I learned to care very much for somebody. I met him at a summer resort like this. I was there with my aunt, and he was there with his mother, who was delicate. We saw a great deal of each other for a little while. He was he was like no other man I had ever seen. You remind me of him somehow. That is partly why I like you so much. I noticed a resemblance the first time I saw you. I don't know in just what it consists. In your expression and the way you carry your head, I think. He was not strong. He coughed a good deal. Then one day he went away suddenly. I had thought he cared for me, but he never said so. Just went away. Oh, the shame of it! After a time I heard that he had been ordered to California for his health, and he died out there the next spring. My heart broke then. I never cared for anybody again. I couldn't. I have always loved him. But it would have been so much easier to bear if I had only known that he loved me. Oh, it would have made all the difference in the world, and the sting of it has been there all these years. I can't even permit myself the joy of dwelling on his memory because of the thought that perhaps he did not care." "He must have cared," I said warmly. "He couldn't have helped it, Miss Sylvia." Miss Sylvia shook her head with a sad smile. "I cannot be sure. Sometimes I think he did, but then the doubt creeps back again. I would give almost anything to know that he did, to know that I have not lavished all the love of my life on a man who did not want it. And I never can know. Never. I can hope and almost believe, but I can never know. Oh, you don't understand. A man couldn't fully understand what my pain has been over it. You see now why I want you to change the story. I am sorry for that poor girl, but if you only let her know that he really loves her, she will not mind all the rest so very much. She will be able to bear the pain of even lifelong separation if she only knows." Miss Sylvia picked up her knitting and went away. As for me, I thought savagely of the dead man she loved and called him a cad, or at best a fool. Next day Miss Sylvia was her serene, smiling self once more, and she did not again make any reference to what she had told me. A fortnight later she returned home, and I went my way back to the world. During the following winter I wrote several letters to Miss Sylvia and received replies from her. Her letters were very like herself. When I sent her the third-rate magazine containing my story, nothing but a third-rate magazine would take it in its rewritten form. She wrote to say that she was so glad that I had let the poor girl know. Early in April I received a letter from an aunt of mine in the country, saying that she intended to sell her place and come to the city to live. She asked me to go out to Sweetwater for a few weeks and assist her in the business of settling up the estate and disposing of such things as she did not wish to take with her. When I arrived at Sweetwater, I found it moist and chill with the sunny moisture and teasing chill of our Canadian springs. They are long and fickle and reluctant, these springs of ours, but oh, the unnameable charm of them! There was something even in the red buds of the maples at Sweetwater and in the long, smoking stretches of hillside fields that sent a thrill through my veins, finer and subtler than any given by old wine. A week after my arrival, when we had got the larger affairs pretty well straightened out, Aunt Mary suggested that I had better overhaul Uncle Alan's room. "The things there have never been meddled with since he died," she said. "In particular, there's an old trunk full of his letters and his papers. It was brought home from California after his death. I've never examined them. I don't suppose there is anything of any importance among them. But I'm not going to carry all that old rubbish to town, so I wish you would look over them and see if there is anything that should be kept. The rest may be burned." I felt no particular interest in the task. My Uncle Alan Blair was a mere name to me. He was my mother's eldest brother and had died years before I was born. I had heard that he had been very clever and that great things had been expected of him, but I anticipated no pleasure from exploring musty old letters and papers of 40 neglected years. I went up to Uncle Alan's room at dusk that night. We had been having a day of warm spring rain, but it had cleared away and the bare maple boughs outside the window were strung with glistening drops. The room looked to the north and was always dim by reason of the close-growing Sweetwater pines. A gap had been cut through them to the northwest, and in it I had a glimpse of the sea Uncle Alan had loved, and above it a wondrous sunset sky fleeced over with little clouds, pale and pink and golden and green, that suddenly reminded me of Miss Sylvia and her fluffy knitting. It was with the thought of her in my mind that I lighted a lamp and began the task of grubbing into Uncle Alan's trunkful of papers. Most of these were bundles of yellowed letters, of no present interest, from his family and college friends. There were several college theses and essays, and a lot of loose miscellanea pertaining to boyish school days. I went through the collection rapidly until at the bottom of the trunk I came to a small book bound in dark green leather. It proved to be a sort of journal, and I began to glance over it with a languid interest. It had been begun in the spring after he had graduated from college. Although suspected only by himself, the disease which was to end his life had already fastened upon him. The entries were those of a doomed man, who, feeling the curse fall on him like a frost, blighting all the fair hopes and promises of life, seeks some help and consolation in the outward self-communing of a journal. There was nothing morbid, nothing unmanly in the record. As I read, I found myself liking Uncle Alan, wishing that he might have lived and been my friend. His mother had not been well that summer, and the doctor ordered her to the seashore. Alan accompanied her. Here occurred a hiatus in the journal. No leaves had been torn out, but a quire or so of them had apparently become loosened from the threads that held them in place. I found them later on in the trunk, but at the time I passed to the next page. It began abruptly. "This girl is the sweetest thing that God ever made. I had not known a woman could be so fair and sweet. Her beauty awes me. The purity of her soul shines so clearly through it like an illuminating lamp. I love her with all my power of loving, and I am thankful that it is so. It would have been hard to die without having known love. I am glad that it has come to me, even if its price is unspeakable bitterness. A man has not lived for nothing who has known and loved Sylvia Stanley Main. I must not seek her love. That is denied me. If I were well and strong, I should win it. Yes, I believe I could win it, and nothing in the world would prevent me from trying. But as things are, it would be the part of a coward to try. Yes, I cannot resist the delight of being with her, of talking to her, of watching her wonderful face. She is in my thoughts day and night. She dwells in my dreams. Oh, Sylvia, I love you, my sweet." A week later there was another entry, July 17th. "I am afraid today I met Sylvia's eyes. In them was a look which at first stirred my heart to its deeps with tumultuous delight, and then I remembered. I must spare her that suffering, at whatever cost to myself. I must not let myself dwell on the dangerous sweetness of the thought that her heart is turning to me. What would be the crowning joy to another man could be only added sorrow to me." Then, July 18th. This morning I took the train to the city. I was determined to know the worst once for all. The time had come when I must. My doctor at home had put me off with vague hopes and perhapses. So I went to a noted physician in the city. I told him I wanted the whole truth. I made him tell it. Stripped of all softening verbiage, it is this: I have perhaps 8 months or a year to live, no more. I had expected it, although not quite so soon. Yet the certainty was none the less bitter. But this is no time for self-pity. It is of Sylvia I must think now. I shall go away at once, before the sweet fancy which is possibly budding in her virgin heart shall have bloomed into a flower that might poison some of her fair years. July 19th. It is over. I said good-bye to her today before others, for I dared not trust myself to see her alone. She looked hurt and startled, as if someone had struck her. But she will soon forget, even if I have not been mistaken in the reading of her eyes. As for me, the bitterness of death is already over in that parting. All that now remains is to play the man to the end. From further entries in the journal I learned that Alan Blair had returned to Sweetwater and later on had been ordered to California. The entries during his sojourn there were few and far between. In all of them he spoke of Sylvia. Finally, after a long silence, he had written: I think the end is not far off now. I am not sorry, for my suffering has been great of late. Last night I was easier. I slept and dreamed that I saw Sylvia. Once or twice I thought that I would arrange to have this book sent to her after my death, but I have decided that it would be unwise. It would only pain her, so I shall destroy it when I feel the time has come. It is sunset in this wonderful summer land. At home in Sweetwater it is only early spring as yet, with snow lingering along the edges of the woods. The sunsets there will be a creamy yellow and pale red now. If I could but see them once more, and Sylvia. There was a little blot where the pen had fallen. Evidently the end had been nearer than Alan Blair had thought. At least there were no more entries, and the little green book had not been destroyed. I was glad that it had not been, and I felt glad that it was thus put in my power to write the last chapter of Miss Sylvia's love story for her. As soon as I could leave Sweetwater I went to the city, 300 miles away, where Miss Sylvia lived. I found her in her library, in her black silk dress and heliotrope shawl, knitting up cream wool, for all the world as if she had just been transplanted from the veranda corner of Harbour Light. "My dear boy," she said. "Do you know why I have come?" I asked. "I am vain enough to think it was because you wanted to see me," she smiled. "I did want to see you, but I would have waited until summer if it had not been that I wished to bring you the missing chapter of your story, dear lady." I don't understand," said Miss Sylvia, starting slightly. "I had an uncle, Alan Blair, who died 40 years ago in California," I said quietly. "Recently I have had occasion to examine some of his papers. I found a journal among them, and I have brought it to you because I think that you have the best right to it." I dropped the parcel in her lap. She was silent with surprise and bewilderment. "And now," I added, "I'm going away. You won't want to see me or anyone for a while after you've read this book, but I will come up to see you tomorrow." When I went the next day, Miss Sylvia herself met me at the door. She caught my hands and drew me into the hall. Her eyes were softly radiant. "Oh, you have made me so happy," she said tremulously. "Oh, you can never know how happy. Nothing hurts now. Nothing ever can hurt, because I know he did care." She laid her face down on my shoulder, as a girl might have nestled to her lover, and I bent and kissed her for Uncle Alan. End of the finished story. The Garden of Spices. Jims tried the door of the blue room. Yes, it was locked. He had hoped Aunt Augusta might have forgotten to lock it. But when did Aunt Augusta forget anything? Except, perhaps, that little boys were not born grown-ups, and that was something she never remembered. To be sure, she was only a half-aunt. Whole aunts probably had more convenient memories. Jims turned and stood with his back against the door. It was better that way. He could not imagine things behind him then. And the blue room was so big and dim that a dreadful number of things could be imagined in it. All the windows were shuttered but one, and that one was so darkened by a big pine tree branching right across it that it did not let in much light. Jims looked very small and lost and lonely as he shrank back against the door, so small and lonely that one might have thought that even the sternest of half aunts should have thought twice before shutting him up in that room and telling him he must stay there the whole afternoon instead of going out for a promised ride. Jims hated being shut up alone, especially in the blue room. Its bigness and dimness and silence filled his sensitive little soul with vague horror. Sometimes he became almost sick with fear in it. To do Aunt Augusta justice, she never suspected this. If she had, she would not have decreed this particular punishment, because she knew Jims was delicate and must not be subjected to any great physical or mental strain. That was why she shut him up instead of whipping him. But how was she to know it? Aunt Augusta was one of those people who never know anything unless it is told them in plain language and then hammered into their heads. There was no one to tell her but Jims, and Jims would have died the death before he would have told Aunt Augusta, with her cold, speckled eyes and thin, smileless mouth, that he was desperately frightened when he was shut in the blue room. So he was always shut in it for punishment, and the punishments came very often, for Jims was always doing things that Aunt Augusta considered naughty. At first, this time, Jims did not feel quite so frightened as usual because he was very angry. As he put it, he was very mad at Aunt Augusta. He hadn't meant to spill his pudding over the floor and the tablecloth and his clothes, and how such a little bit of pudding Aunt Augusta was mean with desserts could ever have spread itself over so much territory, Jims could not understand. But he had made a terrible mess, and Aunt Augusta had been very angry and had said he must be cured of such carelessness. She said he must spend the afternoon in the blue room instead of going for a ride with Mrs. Loring in her new car. Jims was bitterly disappointed. If Uncle Walter had been home Jims would have appealed to him, for when Uncle Walter could be really wakened up to a realization of his small nephew's presence in his home, he was very kind and indulgent. But it was so hard to waken him up that Jims seldom attempted it. He liked Uncle Walter, but as far as being acquainted with him went, he might as well have been the inhabitant of a star in the Milky Way. Jims was just a lonely, solitary little creature, and sometimes he felt so friendless that his eyes smarted and several sobs had to be swallowed. There were no sobs just now, though. Jims was still too angry. It wasn't fair. It was so seldom he got a car ride. Uncle Walter was always too busy attending to sick children all over the town to take him. It was only once in a blue moon Mrs. Loring asked him to go out with her, but she always ended up with ice cream or a movie, and today Jims had had strong hopes that both were on the program. "I hate Aunt Augusta," he said aloud, and then the sound of his voice in that huge still room scared him so that he only thought the rest. "I won't have any fun, and she won't feed my gobbler either." Jims had shrieked, "Feed my gobbler," to the old servant as he had been hauled upstairs. But he didn't think Nancy Jane had heard him, and nobody, not even Jims, could imagine Aunt Augusta feeding the gobbler. It was always a wonder to him that she ate herself. It seemed really too human a thing for her to do. "I wish I'd spilled that pudding on purpose," Jims said vindictively, and with the saying his anger evaporated. Jims never could stay angry long, and left him merely a scared little fellow with velvety nut brown eyes full of fear that should have no place in a child's eyes. He looked so small and helpless as he crouched against the door that one might have wondered if even Aunt Augusta would not have relented had she seen him. How that window at the far end of the room rattled! It sounded terribly as if somebody or something were trying to get in. Jims looked desperately at the unshuttered window. He must get to it. Once there, he could curl up in the window seat, his back to the wall, and forget the shadows by looking out into the sunshine and loveliness of the garden over the wall. Jims would have likely have been found dead of fright in that blue room some time had it not been for the garden over the wall. But to get to the window, Jims must cross the room and pass by the bed. Jims held that bed in special dread. It was the oldest fashioned thing in the old fashioned, old furnitured house. It was high and rigid, and hung with gloomy blue curtains. Anything might jump out of such a bed. Jims gave a gasp and ran madly across the room. He reached the window and flung himself upon the seat. With a sigh of relief he curled down in the corner. Outside, over the high brick wall, was a world where his imagination could roam, though his slender little body was pent a prisoner in the blue room. Jims had loved that garden from the first sight of it. He called it the Garden of Spices, and wove all sorts of yarns in fancy, yarns gay and tragic about it. He had only known it for a few weeks. Before that they had lived in a much smaller house away at the other side of the town. Then Uncle Walter's uncle, who had brought him up just as he was bringing up Jims, had died, and they had all come to live in Uncle Walter's old home. Somehow Jims had an idea that Uncle Walter wasn't very glad to come back there, but he had to according to Great Uncle's will. Jims himself didn't mind much. He liked the smaller rooms in their former home better, but the Garden of Spices made up for all. It was such a beautiful spot. Just inside the wall was a row of aspen poplars that always talked in silvery whispers and shook their dainty heart-shaped leaves at him. Beyond them, under scattered pines, was a rockery where ferns and wild things grew. It was almost as good as a bit of woods, and Jims loved the woods, though he scarcely ever saw them. Then, past the pines, were roses just breaking into June bloom. Roses in such profusion as Jims hadn't known existed, with dear little paths twisting about among the bushes. It seemed to be a garden where no frost could blight or rough wind blow. When rain fell, it must fall very gently. Past the roses one saw a green lawn, sprinkled over now with white ghosts of dandelions, and dotted with ornamental trees. The trees grew so thickly that they almost hid the house to which the garden pertained. It was a large one of grey-black stone, with stacks of huge chimneys. Jims had no idea who lived there. He had asked Aunt Augusta, and Aunt Augusta had frowned and told him it did not matter who lived there, and that he must never on any account mention the next house or its occupant to Uncle Walter. Jims would never have thought of mentioning them to Uncle Walter, but the prohibition filled him with an unholy and unsubduable curiosity. He was devoured by the desire to find out who the folks in that tabooed house were, and he longed to have the freedom of that garden. Jims loved gardens. There had been a garden at the little house, but there was none here. Nothing but an old lawn that had been fine once but was now badly run to seed. Jims had heard Uncle Walter say that he was going to have it attended to, but nothing had been done yet. And meanwhile there was a beautiful garden over the wall, which looked as if it should be full of children, but no children were ever in it, or anybody else apparently, and so, in spite of its beauty, it had a lonely look that hurt Jims. He wanted his Garden of Spices to be full of laughter. He pictured himself running in it with imaginary playmates, and there was a mother in it, or a big sister, or at the least a whole aunt who would let you hug her and would never dream of shutting you up in chilly, shadowy, horrible blue rooms. "It seems to me," said Jims, flattening his nose against the pane, "that I must get into that garden or bust." Aunt Augusta would have said icily, "We do not use such expressions, James," but Aunt Augusta was not there to hear. "I'm afraid the Very Handsome Cat isn't coming today," sighed Jims. Then he brightened up. The Very Handsome Cat was coming across the lawn. He was the only living thing, barring birds and butterflies, that Jims ever saw in the garden. Jims worshipped that cat. He was jet black, with white paws and dicky, and he had as much dignity as 10 cats. Jim's fingers tingled to stroke him. Jims had never been allowed to have even a kitten, because Aunt Augusta had a horror of cats, and you cannot stroke gobblers. The Very Handsome Cat came through the rose garden path on his beautiful paws, ambled daintily around the rockery, and sat down in a shady spot under a pine tree, right where Jims could see him, through a gap in the little poplars. He looked straight up at Jims and winked. At least Jims always believed and declared he did, and that wink said, or seemed to say plainly, "Be a sport. Come down here and play with me. A fig for your Aunt Augusta." A wild, daring, absurd idea flashed into Jim's brain. Could he? He could. He would. He knew it would be easy. He had thought it all out many times, although until now he had never dreamed of really doing it. To unhook the window and swing it open, to step out on the pine bough and from it to another that hung over the wall and dropped nearly to the ground, to spring from it to the velvet sward under the poplars. Why, it was all the work of a minute. With a careful, repressed whoop, Jims ran towards the Very Handsome Cat. The cat rose and retreated in deliberate haste. Jims ran after him. The cat dodged through the rose paths and eluded Jim's eager hands, just keeping tantalizingly out of reach. Jims had forgotten everything except that he must catch the cat. He was full of a fearful joy, with an elfin delight running through it. He had escaped from the blue room and its ghosts. He was in his garden of spices. He had got the better of mean old Aunt Augusta. But he must catch the cat. The cat ran over the lawn, and Jims pursued it through the green gloom of the thickly clustering trees. Beyond them came a pool of sunshine, in which the old stone house basked like a huge grey cat itself. More garden was before it and beyond it, wonderful with blossom. Under a huge spreading beech tree in the centre of it was a little tea table. Sitting by the table reading was a lady in a black dress. The cat, having lured Jims to where he wanted him, sat down and began to lick his paws. He was quite willing to be caught now, but Jims had no longer any idea of catching him. He stood very still, looking at the lady. She did not see him then, and Jims could only see her profile, which he thought very beautiful. She had wonderful ropes of blue-black hair wound around her head. She looked so sweet that Jim's heart beat. Then she lifted her head and turned her face and saw him. Jims felt something of a shock. She was not pretty after all. One side of her face was marked by a dreadful red scar. It quite spoiled her good looks, which Jims thought a great pity. But nothing could spoil the sweetness of her face or the loveliness of her peculiar, soft, grey-blue eyes. Jims couldn't remember his mother and had no idea what she looked like, but the thought came into his head that he would have liked her to have eyes like that. After the first moment, Jims did not mind the scar at all. But perhaps that first moment had revealed itself in his face, for a look of pain came into the lady's eyes, and almost involuntarily, it seemed, she put her hand up to hide the scar. Then she pulled it away again and sat looking at Jims, half defiantly, half piteously. Jims thought she must be angry because he had chased her cat. "I beg your pardon," he said gravely. "I didn't mean to hurt your cat. I just wanted to play with him. He is such a very handsome cat." "But where did you come from?" said the lady. "It is so long since I saw a child in this garden," she added, as if to herself. Her voice was as sweet as her face. Jims thought he was mistaken in thinking her angry, and plucked up heart of grace. Shyness was no fault of Jims. "I came from the house over the wall," he said. "My name is James Brander Churchill. Aunt Augusta shut me up in the blue room because I spilled my pudding at dinner. I hate to be shut up, and I was to have had a ride this afternoon, and ice cream, and maybe a movie, so I was mad. And when your Very Handsome Cat came and looked at me, I just got out and climbed down." He looked straight at her and smiled. Jims had a very dear little smile. It seemed a pity there was no mother alive to revel in it. The lady smiled back. "I think you did right," she said. "You wouldn't shut a little boy up if you had one, would you?" said Jims. "Oh, no, no, dear heart, I wouldn't," said the lady. She said it as if something hurt her horribly. She smiled again gallantly. "Will you come here and sit down?" she added, pulling a chair out from the table. "Thank you. I'd rather sit here," said Jims, plumping down on the grass at her feet. "Then maybe your cat will come to me." The cat came over promptly and rubbed his head against Jim's knee. Jims stroked him delightedly. How lovely his soft fur felt, and his round, velvety head! "I like cats," explained Jims, "and I have nothing but a gobbler. This is such a very handsome cat. What is his name, please?" "Black Prince. He loves me," said the lady. "He always comes to my bed in the morning and wakes me up by patting my face with his paw. He doesn't mind my being ugly." She spoke with a bitterness Jims couldn't understand. "But you're not ugly," he said. "Oh, I am ugly. I am ugly," she cried. "Just look at me right at me. Doesn't it hurt you to look at me?" Jims looked at her gravely and dispassionately. "No, it doesn't," he said. "Not a bit," he added, after some further exploration of his consciousness. Suddenly the lady laughed beautifully. A faint rosy flush came into her unscarred cheek. "James, I believe you mean it." "Of course I mean it. And if you don't mind, please call me Jims. Nobody calls me James but Aunt Augusta. She isn't my whole aunt. She's just Uncle Walter's half sister. He's my whole uncle." "What does he call you?" asked the lady. She looked away as she asked it. "Oh, Jims, when he thinks about me. He doesn't often think about me. He has too many sick children to think about." "Sick children are all Uncle Walter cares about. He's the greatest children's doctor in the Dominion, Mr. Burroughs says. But he is a woman hater." "How do you know that?" "Oh, I heard Mr. Burroughs say it. Mr. Burroughs is my tutor, you know. I study with him from 9 till 1. I'm not allowed to go to the public school. I'd like to, but Uncle Walter thinks I'm not strong enough yet. I'm going next year, though, when I'm 10. I have holidays now. Mr. Burroughs always goes away the 1st of June." "How came he to tell you your uncle was a woman hater?" persisted the lady. "Oh, he didn't tell me. He was talking to a friend of his. He thought I was reading my book. So I was, but I heard it all. It was more interesting than my book. Uncle Walter was engaged to a lady long, long ago, when he was a young man. She was devilishly pretty. Oh, Jims, Mr. Burroughs said so. I'm only quoting," said Jims easily. "And Uncle Walter just worshipped her, and all at once she just jilted him without a word of explanation, Mr. Burroughs said. So that is why he hates women. It isn't any wonder, is it?" "I suppose not," said the lady with a sigh. "Jims, are you hungry?" "Yes, I am. You see, the pudding was spilled. But how did you know?" "Oh, boys always used to be hungry when I knew them long ago. I thought they hadn't changed. I shall tell Martha to bring out something to eat, and we'll have it here under this tree. You sit here. I'll sit there. Jims, it's so long since I talked to a little boy that I'm not sure that I know how." "You know how, all right," Jims assured her. "But what am I to call you, please?" "My name is Miss Garland," said the lady a little hesitantly. But she saw the name meant nothing to Jims. "I would like you to call me Miss Avery. Avery's my first name, and I never hear it nowadays. Now for a jamboree. I can't offer you a movie, and I'm afraid there isn't any ice cream either. I could have had some if I'd known you were coming, but I think Martha will be able to find something good." A very old woman, who looked at Jims with great amazement, came out to set the table. Jims thought she must be as old as Methuselah, but he did not mind her. He ran races with the Black Prince while tea was being prepared, and rolled the delighted cat over and over in the grass. And he discovered a fragrant herb garden in a far corner, and was delighted. Now it was truly a garden of spices. "Oh, it is so beautiful here," he told Miss Avery, who sat and looked at his revels with a hungry expression in her lovely eyes. "I wish I could come often." "Why can't you?" said Miss Avery. The two looked at each other with sly intelligence. "I could come whenever Aunt Augusta shuts me up in the blue room," said Jims. "Yes," said Miss Avery. Then she laughed and held out her arms. Jims flew into them. He put his arms about her neck and kissed her scarred face. "Oh, I wish you were my aunt," he said. Miss Avery suddenly pushed him away. Jims was horribly afraid he had offended her. But she took his hand. "We'll just be chums, Jim," she said. "That's really better than being relations, after all. Come and have tea." Over that glorious tea table they became lifelong friends. They had always known each other, and always would. The Black Prince sat between them and was fed tidbits. There was such a lot of good things on the table, and nobody to say, "You've had enough, James." James ate until he thought he had enough. Aunt Augusta would have thought he was doomed, could she have seen him. "I suppose I must go back," said Jims with a sigh. "It will be our supper time in half an hour, and Aunt Augusta will come to take me out." "But she'll come again." "Yes, the first time she shuts me up, and if she doesn't shut me up pretty soon I'll be so bad she'll have to shut me up. I'll always set a place for you at the tea table after this, Jims, and when you're not here I'll pretend you are. And when you can't come here, write me a letter and bring it when you do come." "Good bye," said Jims. He took her hand and kissed it. He had read of a young knight doing that, and had always thought he would like to try it if he ever got a chance. But who could dream of kissing Aunt Augusta's hands? "You dear funny thing," said Miss Avery. "Have you thought of how you are to get back? Can you reach that pine bough from the ground?" "Maybe I can jump," said Jims dubiously. "I'm afraid not. I'll give you a stool and you can stand on it. Just leave it there for future use. Good bye, Jims. Jims, 2 hours ago I didn't know there was such a person in the world as you, and now I love you. I love you." Jim's heart filled with a great warm gush of gladness. He had always wanted to be loved. No living creature, he felt sure, loved him except his gobbler, and a gobbler's love is not very satisfying, though it is better than nothing. He was blissfully happy as he carried his stool across the lawn. He climbed his pine and went in at the window and curled up on the seat in a maze of delight. The blue room was more shadowy than ever, but that did not matter. Over in the Garden of Spices was friendship and laughter and romance galore. The whole world was transformed for Jims. From that time Jims lived a shamelessly double life. Whenever he was shut in the blue room he escaped to the Garden of Spices, and he was shut in very often, for Mr. Burroughs being away he got into a good deal of what Aunt Augusta called mischief. Besides, it is a sad truth that Jims didn't try very hard to be good now. He thought it paid better to be bad and be shut up. To be sure, there was always a fly in the ointment. He was haunted by a vague fear that Aunt Augusta might relent and come to the blue room before supper time to let him out. And then the fat would be in the fire, said Jims. But he had a glorious summer, and throve so well on his new diet of love and companionship that one day Uncle Walter, with fewer sick children to think about than usual, looked at him curiously and said, "Augusta, that boy seems to be growing much stronger. He has a good colour, and his eyes are getting to look more like a boy's eyes should. We'll make a man of you yet, Jims." "He may be getting stronger, but he's getting naughtier too," said Aunt Augusta grimly. "I am sorry to say, Walter, that he behaves very badly." "We were all young once," said Uncle Walter indulgently. "Were you?" asked Jims in blank amazement. Uncle Walter laughed. "Do you think me an antediluvian, Jims?" "I don't know what that is, but your hair is gray and your eyes are tired," said Jims uncompromisingly. Uncle Walter laughed again, tossed Jims a quarter, and went out. "Your uncle is only 45 and in his prime," said Aunt Augusta dourly. Jims deliberately ran across the room to the window and, under pretense of looking out, knocked down a flower pot. So he was exiled to the blue room, and got into his beloved Garden of Spices, where Miss Avery's beautiful eyes looked love into his, and the Black Prince was a jolly playmate, and old Martha petted and spoiled him to her heart's content. Jims never asked questions, but he was a wide awake chap, and taking one thing with another, he found out a good deal about the occupants of the old stone house. Miss Avery never went anywhere, and no one ever went there. She lived all alone, with 2 old servants, man and maid. Except these 2 and Jims, nobody had ever seen her for 20 years. Jims didn't know why, but he thought it must be because of the scar on her face. He never referred to it, but one day Miss Avery told him what caused it. "I dropped a lamp, and my dress caught fire and burned my face, Jims. It made me hideous. I was beautiful before that, very beautiful. Everybody said so. Come in and I'll show you my picture." She took him into her big parlour and showed him the picture hanging on the wall between the 2 high windows. It was of a young girl in white. She certainly was very lovely, with her rose-leaf skin and laughing eyes. Jims looked at the pictured face gravely, with his hands in his pockets and his head on one side. Then he looked at Miss Avery. "You were prettier then, yes," he said, judicially, "but I like your face ever so much better now." "Oh, Jims, you can't," she protested. "Yes, I do," persisted Jims. "You look kinder and nicer now." It was the nearest Jims could get to expressing what he felt as he looked at the picture. The young girl was beautiful, but her face was a little hard. There was pride and vanity and something of the insolence of great beauty in it. There was nothing of that in Miss Avery's face now, nothing but sweetness and tenderness and a motherly yearning to which every fibre of Jim's small being responded. How they loved each other, those two, and how they understood each other! To love is easy, and therefore common, but to understand, how rare that is. And oh, such good times as they had! They made taffy. Jims had always longed to make taffy, but Aunt Augusta's immaculate kitchen and saucepans might not be so desecrated. They read fairy tales together. Mr. Burroughs had disapproved of fairy tales. They blew soap bubbles out on the lawn and let them float away over the garden and the orchard like fairy balloons. They had glorious afternoon teas under the beech tree. They made ice cream themselves. Jims even slid down the banister when he wanted to, and he could try out a slang word or two occasionally without anybody dying of horror. Miss Avery did not seem to mind it a bit. At first, Miss Avery always wore dark, sombre dresses, but one day Jims found her in a pretty gown of pale primrose silk. It was very old and old-fashioned, but Jims did not know that. He capered round her in delight. "You like me better in this?" she asked wistfully. "I like you just as well no matter what you wear," said Jims, "but that dress is awfully pretty." "Would you like me to wear bright colours, Jims?" "You bet I would," said Jims emphatically. After that she always wore them, pink and primrose and blue and white, and she let Jims wreath flowers in her splendid hair. He had quite a knack of it. She never wore any jewelry except always a little gold ring with a design of two clasped hands. "A friend gave that to me long ago when we were boy and girl together at school," she told Jims once. "I never take it off, night or day. When I die it is to be buried with me." "You mustn't die till I do," said Jims in dismay. "Oh, Jims, if we could only live together nothing else would matter," she said hungrily. "Jims, Jims, I see so little of you really, and some day soon you'll be going to school, and I'll lose you." "I've got to think of some way to prevent it," cried Jims. "I won't have it. I won't. I won't." But his heart sank notwithstanding. One day Jims slipped from the blue room, down the pine and across the lawn with a tear-stained face. "Aunt Augusta is going to kill my gobbler," he sobbed to Miss Avery's arms. "She says she isn't going to bother with him any longer, and he's getting old, and he's to be killed, and that gobbler's the only friend I have in the world except you. Oh, I can't stand it, Miss Avery." Next day Aunt Augusta told him the gobbler had been sold and taken away, and Jims flew into a passion of tears and protest about it and was promptly incarcerated in the blue room. A few minutes later a sobbing boy plunged through the trees and stopped abruptly. Miss Avery was reading under the beech, and the Black Prince was snoozing on her knee, and a big, magnificent bronze turkey was parading about on the lawn, twisting his huge fan of a tail this way and that. "My gobbler!" cried Jims. "Yes, Martha went to your uncle's house and bought him. Oh, she didn't betray you. She told Nancy Jane she wanted a gobbler, and having seen one over there, thought perhaps she could get him. See, here's your pet, Jims, and here he shall live till he dies of old age. And I have something else for you. Edward and Martha went across the river yesterday to the Murray kennels and got it for you." "Not a dog!" exclaimed Jims. "Yes, a dear little bull pup. He shall be your very own, Jims, and I only stipulate that you reconcile the Black Prince to him." It was something of a task, but Jims succeeded. Then followed a month of perfect happiness. At least 3 afternoons a week they contrived to be together. It was all too good to be true, Jims felt. Something would happen soon to spoil it. Just suppose Aunt Augusta grew tender-hearted and ceased to punish, or Suppose she suddenly discovered that he was growing too big to be shut up. Jims began to stint himself in eating lest he grew too fast, and then Aunt Augusta worried about his loss of appetite and suggested to Uncle Walter that he should be sent to the country till the hot weather was over. Jims didn't want to go to the country now because his heart was elsewhere. He must eat again. If he grew like a weed, it was all very harassing. Uncle Walter looked at him keenly. "Seems to me you're looking pretty fit, Jims. Do you want to go to the country?" "No, please." "Are you happy, Jims?" "Sometimes." "A boy should be happy all the time, Jims. If I had a mother and someone to play with, I would be." "I have tried to be a mother to you, Jims," said Aunt Augusta in an offended tone. Then she addressed Uncle Walter. "A younger woman would probably understand him better, and I feel that the care of this big place is too much for me. I would prefer to go to my own old home. If you had married long ago, as you should, Walter, James would have had a mother and some cousins to play with. I have always been of this opinion." Uncle Walter frowned and got up. "Just because one woman played you false is no good reason for spoiling your life," went on Aunt Augusta severely. "I have kept silence all these years, but now I am going to speak, and speak plainly. You should marry, Walter. You are young enough yet, and you owe it to your name." "Listen, Augusta," said Uncle Walter sternly. "I loved a woman once. I believe she loved me. She sent me back my ring one day, and with it a message saying she had ceased to care for me, and bidding me never to try to look upon her face again. Well, I have obeyed her, that is all. There was something strange about all that, Walter. The life she has since led proves that. So you should not let it embitter you against all women." "I haven't. It's nonsense to say I'm a woman hater, Augusta, but that experience has robbed me of the power to care for another woman." "Well, this isn't a proper conversation for a child to hear," said Aunt Augusta, recollecting herself. "Jims, go out." Jims would have given one of his ears to stay and listen with the other, but he went obediently. And then, the very next day, the dreaded something happened. It was the 1st of August, and very, very hot. Jims was late coming to dinner, and Aunt Augusta reproved him, and Jims deliberately and with malice aforethought told her he thought she was a nasty old woman. He had never been saucy to Aunt Augusta before, but it was 3 days since he had seen Miss Avery and the Black Prince and Nip, and he was desperate. Aunt Augusta crimsoned with anger and doomed Jims to an afternoon in the blue room for impertinence. "And I shall tell your uncle when he comes home," she added. That rankled, for Jims didn't want Uncle Walter to think him impertinent, but he forgot all his worries as he scampered through the Garden of Spices to the beech tree, and there Jims stopped as if he had been shot. Prone on the grass under the beech tree, white and cold and still, lay his Miss Avery, dead, stone dead. At least Jims drought she was dead. He flew into the house like a mad thing, shrieking for Martha. Nobody answered. Jims recollected with a rush of sickening dread that Miss Avery had told him Martha and Edward were going away that day to visit a sister. He rushed blindly across the lawn again, through the little side gate he had never passed before, and down the street home. Uncle Walter was just opening the door of his car. "Uncle Walter, come, come!" sobbed Jims, clutching frantically at his hand. "Miss Avery's dead, dead! Oh, come quick!" "Who is dead?" Miss Avery Garland. She's lying on the grass over there in her garden, and I love her so, and I'll die too. Oh, Uncle Walter, come!" Uncle Walter looked as if he wanted to ask some questions, but he said nothing. With a strange face he hurried after Jims. Miss Avery was still lying there. As Uncle Walter bent over her, he saw the broad red scar and started back with an exclamation. "She is dead!" gasped Jims. "No," said Uncle Walter, bending down again. "No, she has only fainted, Jims. Overcome by the heat, I suppose. I want help. Go and call somebody." "There's no one home here today," said Jims, in a spasm of joy so great that it shook him like a leaf. "Then go home and telephone over to Mr. Loring's. Tell them I want the nurse who is there to come here for a few minutes." Jims did his errand. Uncle Walter and the nurse carried Miss Avery into the house, and then Jims went back to the blue room. He was so unhappy he didn't care where he went. He wished something would jump at him out of the bed and put an end to him. Everything was discovered now, and he would never see Miss Avery again. Jims lay very still on the window seat. He did not even cry. He had come to one of the griefs that lie too deep for tears. I think I must have been put under a curse at birth, thought poor Jims. Over at the stone house, Miss Avery was lying on the couch in her room. The nurse had gone away, and Dr. Walter was sitting looking at her. He leaned forward and pulled away the hand with which she was hiding the scar on her face. He looked first at the little gold ring on the hand and then at the scar. "Don't," she said piteously. "Avery, why did you do it? Why did you do it?" "Oh, you know. You must know now, Walter." "Avery, did you break my heart and spoil my life and your own simply because your face was scarred?" "I couldn't bear to have you see me hideous," she moaned. "You had been so proud of my beauty. I thought you couldn't love me any more. I couldn't bear the thought of looking in your eyes and seeing aversion there." Walter Grant leaned forward. "Look in my eyes, Avery. Do you see any aversion?" Avery forced herself to look. What she saw covered her face with a hot blush. "Did you think my love such a poor and superficial thing, Avery," he said sternly, "that it must vanish because a blemish came on your fairness? Do you think that would change me? Was your own love for me so slight?" "No, no," she sobbed. "I have loved you every moment of my life, Walter. Oh, don't look at me so sternly." "If you had even told me," he said. "You said I was never to try to look on your face again, and they told me you had gone away. You sent me back my ring." "I kept the old one," she interrupted, holding out her hand. "The first one you ever gave me. Do you remember, Walter, when we were boy and girl? You robbed me of all that made life worth while, Avery. Do you wonder that I've been a bitter man?" "I was wrong. I was wrong," she sobbed. "I should have believed in you. But don't you think I've paid too? Forgive me, Walter. It's too late to atone, but forgive me." "Is it too late?" he asked gravely. She pointed to the scar. "Could you endure seeing this opposite you every day at your table?" she asked bitterly. "Yes, if I could see your sweet eyes and your beloved smile with it, Avery," he answered passionately. "Oh, Avery, it was you I loved, not your outward favour. Oh, how foolish you were, foolish and morbid. You always put too high a value on your beauty. Avery, if I had dreamed of the true state of the case, if I had known you were here all these years why, I heard a rumour long ago that you had married, Avery, but if I had known, I would have come to you and made you be sensible." She gave a little laugh at his lame conclusion. That was so like the old Walter. Then her eyes filled with tears as he took her in his arms. The door of the blue room opened. Jims did not look up. It was Aunt Augusta, of course, and she had heard the whole story. "Jims, boy?" Jims lifted his miserable eyes. It was Uncle Walter, but a different Uncle Walter, an Uncle Walter with laughing eyes and a strange radiance of youth about him. "Poor, lonely little fellow," said Uncle Walter unexpectedly. "Jims, would you like Miss Avery to come here and live with us always and be your real aunt?" "Great snake!" said Jims, transformed in a second. "Is there any chance of that?" "There is a certainty, thanks to you," said Uncle Walter. "You can go over to see her for a little while. Don't talk her to death. She's weak yet. And attend to that menagerie of yours over there. She's worrying because the bulldog and gobbler weren't fed. And Jims—" But Jims had swung down through the pine and was tearing across the Garden of Spices. End of Garden of Spices. The Girl and the Photograph. When I heard that Peter Austin was in Vancouver, I hunted him up. I had met Peter 10 years before, when I had gone east to visit my father's people, and had spent a few weeks with an uncle in Croyden. The Austins lived across the street from Uncle Tom, and Peter and I struck up a friendship, although he was a hobbledehoy of awkward 16, and I, at 22, was older and wiser and more dignified than I've ever been since or ever expect to be again. Peter was a jolly little round freckled chap. He was all right when no girls were around. When they were, he retired within himself like a misanthropic oyster, and was about as interesting. This was one point upon which we always disagreed. Peter couldn't endure girls. I was devoted to them by the wholesale. The Croydon girls were pretty and vivacious. I had a score of flirtations during my brief sojourn among them. But when I went away, the face I carried in my memory was not that of any girl with whom I had walked and driven and played the game of hearts. It was 10 years ago, but I had never been quite able to forget that girl's face. Yet I had seen it but once, and then only for a moment. I had gone for a solitary ramble in the woods, over the river, and in a lovely little valley dim with pines, where I thought myself alone. I had come suddenly upon her, standing ankle deep in fern on the bank of a brook, the late evening sunshine falling yellowly on her uncovered dark hair. She was very young, no more than 16, yet the face and eyes were already those of a woman. Such a face! Beautiful? Yes, but I thought of that afterward, when I was alone. With that face before my eyes, I thought only of its purity and sweetness, of the lovely soul and rich mind looking out of the great, grayish blue eyes, which in the dimness of the pine shadows looked almost black. There was something in the face of that child woman I had never seen before, and was destined never to see again in any other face. Careless boy though I was, it stirred me to the deeps. I felt that she must have been waiting forever in that pine valley for me, and that in finding her I had found all of good that life could offer me. I would have spoken to her, but before I could shape my greeting into words that should not seem rude or presumptuous, she had turned and gone, stepping lightly across the brook and vanishing in the maple copse beyond. For no more than 10 seconds had I gazed into her face, and the soul of her, the real woman behind the fair outwardness, had looked back into my eyes, but I had never been able to forget it. When I returned home, I questioned my cousin diplomatically as to who she might be. I felt strangely reluctant to do so. It seemed in some way sacrilege, yet only by so doing could I hope to discover her. They could tell me nothing, nor did I meet her again during the remainder of my stay in Croydon, although I never went anywhere without looking for her, and haunted the pine valley daily, in the hope of seeing her again. My disappointment was so bitter that I laughed at myself. I thought I was a fool to feel thus about a girl I had met for a moment in a chance ramble, a mere child at that, with her hair still hanging in its long, glossy schoolgirl braid. But when I remembered her eyes, my wisdom forgave me. Well, that was 10 years ago. In those 10 years the memory had, I must confess, grown dimmer. In our busy Western life a man had not much time for sentimental recollections. Yet I had never been able to care for another woman. I wanted to. I wanted to marry and settle down. I had come to the time of life when a man wearies of drifting and begins to hanker for a calm anchorage in some snug haven of his own. But somehow I shirked the matter. It seemed rather easier to let things slide. At this stage Peter came west. He was something in a bank and was as round and jolly as ever. But he had evidently changed his attitude toward girls, for his rooms were full of their photos. They were stuck around everywhere, and they were all pretty. Either Peter had excellent taste, or the Croydon photographers knew how to flatter. But there was one on the mantel which attracted my attention especially. If the photo were to be trusted, the girl was quite the prettiest I had ever seen. "Peter, what pretty girl's picture is this on your mantel?" I called out to Peter, who was in his bedroom donning evening dress for some function. "That's my cousin, Marian Lindsay," he answered. "She's rather nice looking, isn't she? Lives in Croydon now. Used to live up the river at Chislehurst. Didn't you ever chance across her when you were in Croydon?" "No," I said. "If I had, I wouldn't have forgotten her face." "Well,
She'd be only a child then, of course. She's 26 now. Marion is a mighty nice girl, but she's bound to be an old maid. She's got notions, ideals, she calls them. All the Croyden fellows have been in love with her at one time or another, but they might as well have made up to a statue. Marion really hasn't a spark of feeling or sentiment in her. Her looks are the best part of her, although she's confoundedly clever." Peter spoke rather squiffily. I suspected that he had been one of the smitten swains himself. I looked at the photo for a few minutes longer, admiring it more every minute, and when I heard Peter coming out I did an unjustifiable thing. I took that photo and put it in my pocket. I expected Peter would make a fuss when he missed it, but that very night the house in which he lived was burned to the ground. Peter escaped with the most important of his goods and chattels, but all the counterfeit presentments of his dear divinities went up in smoke. If he ever thought particularly of Marion Lindsay's photograph, he must have supposed that it shared the fate of the others. As for me, I propped my ill-gotten treasure up on my mantel and worshipped it for a fortnight. At the end of that time I went boldly to Peter and told him I wanted him to introduce me by letter to his dear cousin and ask her to agree to a friendly correspondence with me. Oddly enough, I did not do this without some reluctance. In spite of the fact that I was as much in love with Marion Lindsay as it was possible to be through the medium of a picture, I thought of the girl I had seen in the pine wood and felt an inward shrinking from a step that might divide me from her forever. But I rated myself for this nonsense. It was in the highest degree unlikely that I should ever meet the girl of the pines again. If she were still living, she was probably some other man's wife. I would think no more about it. Peter whistled when he heard what I had to say. "Of course I'll do it, old man," he said obligingly. "But I warn you I don't think it will be much use. Marion isn't the sort of girl to open up a correspondence in such a fashion. However, I'll do the best I can for you. Do tell her I'm a respectable fellow with no violent bad habits and all that. I'm in earnest, Peter. I want to make that girl's acquaintance, and this seems the only way at present. I can't get off just now for a trip east. Explain all this, and use your cousinly influence in my behalf, if you possess any." Peter grinned. "It's not the most graceful job in the world you're putting on me, Curtis," he said. "I don't mind owning up now that I was pretty far gone on Marion myself 2 years ago. It's all over now, but it was bad while it lasted. Perhaps Marion will consider your request more favourably if I put it in the light of a favour to myself. She must feel that she owes me something for wrecking my life." Peter grinned again and looked at the one photo he had contrived to rescue from the fire. It was a pretty snub-nosed little girl. She would never have consoled me for the loss of Marion Lindsay, but every man to his taste. In due time Peter sought me out to give me his cousin's answer. "Congratulations, Curtis. You've out-Caesared Caesar. You've conquered without even going and seeing. Marion agrees to a friendly correspondence with you. I am amazed, I admit, even though I did paint you up as a sort of Sir Galahad and Lancelot combined. I'm not used to seeing proud Marion do stunts like that, and it rather takes my breath." I wrote to Marion Lindsay after one farewell dream of the girl under the pines. When Marion's letters began to come regularly, I forgot the other one altogether. Such letters! Such witty, sparkling, clever, womanly, delightful letters! They completed the conquest her picture had begun. Before we had corresponded 6 months, I was besottedly in love with this woman whom I had never seen. Finally, I wrote and told her so, and I asked her to be my wife. A fortnight later her answer came. She said frankly that she believed she had learned to care for me during our correspondence, but that she thought we should meet in person, before coming to any definite understanding. Could I not arrange to visit Croyden in the summer? Until then we would better continue on our present footing. I agreed to this, but I considered myself practically engaged, with the personal meeting merely to be regarded as a sop to the Cerberus of conventionality. I permitted myself to use a decidedly lover-like tone in my letters henceforth, and I held it as a favourable omen that I was not rebuked for this,
although Marian's own letters still retained their pleasant, simple friendliness. Peter had at first tormented me mercilessly about the affair, but when he saw I did not like his chaff, he stopped it. Peter was always a good fellow. He realized that I regarded the matter seriously, and he saw me off when I left for the East with a grin tempered by honest sympathy and understanding. "Good luck to you," he said. "If you win Marian Lindsay, you'll win a pearl among women. I haven't been able to grasp her taking to you in this fashion, though. It's so unlike Marian. But since she undoubtedly has, you are a lucky man." I arrived in Croyden at dusk and went to Uncle Tom's. There I found them busy with preparations for a party to be given that night in honour of a girl friend who was visiting my cousin Edna. I was secretly annoyed, for I wanted to hasten at once to Marian. But I couldn't decently get away, and on second thought I was consoled by the reflection that she would probably come to the party. I knew she belonged to the same social set as Uncle Tom's girls. I should, however, have preferred our meeting to have been under different circumstances. From my stand behind the palms in a corner, I eagerly scanned the guests as they arrived. Suddenly my heart gave a bound. Marian Lindsay had just come in. I recognized her at once from her photograph. It had not flattered her in the least. Indeed, it had not done her justice, for her exquisite colouring of hair and complexion were quite lost in it. She was, moreover, gowned with a taste and smartness eminently admirable in the future Mrs. Eric Curtis. I felt a thrill of proprietary pride as I stepped out from behind the palms. She was talking to Aunt Grace, but her eyes fell on me. I expected a little start of recognition, for I had sent her an excellent photograph of myself, but her gaze was one of blankest unconsciousness. I felt something like disappointment at her non-recognition, but I consoled myself by the reflection that people often fail to recognize other people whom they have seen only in photographs, no matter how good the likeness may be. I waylaid Edna, who was passing at that time, and said, "Edna, I want you to introduce me to the girl who is talking to your mother." Edna laughed. "So you have succumbed at first sight to our Croyden beauty. Of course I'll introduce you, but I warn you beforehand that she is the most incorrigible flirt in Croyden, or out of it. So take care." It jarred on me to hear Marian called a flirt. It seemed so out of keeping with her letters, and the womanly delicacy and fineness revealed in them. But I reflected that women sometimes find it hard to forgive another woman who absorbs more than her share of lovers, and generally take their revenge by dubbing her a flirt, whether she deserves the name or not. We had crossed the room during this reflection. Marian turned and stood before us, smiling at Edna, but evincing no recognition whatever of myself. It is a piquant experience to find yourself awaiting an introduction to a girl to whom you are virtually engaged. "Dorothy, dear," said Edna, "this is my cousin, Mr. Curtis, from Vancouver. Eric, this is Miss Armstrong." I suppose I bowed. Habit carries us mechanically through many impossible situations. I don't know what I looked like or what I said, if I said anything. I don't suppose I betrayed my dire confusion, for Edna went off unconcernedly without another glance at me. Dorothy Armstrong? Gracious powers! Who? Where? Why? If this girl was Dorothy Armstrong, who was Marian Lindsay? To whom was I engaged? There was some awful mistake somewhere, for it could not be possible that there were two girls in Croyden who looked exactly like the photograph reposing in my valise at that very moment. I stammered like a schoolboy. I your face seems familiar to me, Miss Armstrong. I think I must have seen your photograph somewhere." "Probably in Peter Austin's collection," smiled Miss Armstrong. "He had one of mine before he was burned out. How is he?" "Peter? Oh, he's well," I replied vaguely. I was thinking 100 words to the second, but my thoughts arrived nowhere. I was staring at Miss Armstrong like a man bewitched. She must have thought me a veritable booby. "Oh, by the way, can you tell me, do you know a Miss Lindsay in Croyden?" Miss Armstrong looked surprised and a little bored. Evidently she was not used to having newly introduced young men inquiring about another girl. Marian Lindsay? Oh, yes. Is she here tonight? I said. No, Marian's not going to parties just now, owing to the recent death of her aunt, who lived with them. Does she look like you at all? I inquired idiotically. Amusement glimmered, but over Miss Armstrong's boredom. She probably concluded that I was some harmless lunatic. Like me? Not at all. There couldn't be two people more dissimilar. Marian is quite dark. I'm fair, and our features are altogether unlike. Why, good evening, Jack. Yes, I believe I did promise you this dance." She bowed to me and skimmed away with Jack. I saw Aunt Grace bearing down upon me and fled incontentedly. In my own room I flung myself on a chair and tried to think the matter out. Where did the mistake come in? How had it happened? I shut my eyes and conjured up the vision of Peter's room that day. I remembered vaguely that when I had picked up Dorothy Armstrong's picture, I had noticed another photograph that had fallen face downward beside it. That must have been Marian Lindsay's, and Peter had thought I meant it. And now what a position I was in! I was conscious of bitter disappointment. I had fallen in love with Dorothy Armstrong's photograph. As far as external semblance goes, it was she whom I loved. I was practically engaged to another woman, a woman who, in spite of our correspondence, seemed to me now, in the shock of this discovery, a stranger. It was useless to tell myself that it was the mind and soul revealed in those letters that I loved, and that that mind and soul were Marian Lindsay's. It was useless to remember that Peter had said she was pretty. Exteriorly, she was a stranger to me. Hers was not the face which had risen before me for nearly a year as the face of the woman I loved. Was ever unlucky wretch in such a predicament before? Well, there was only one thing to do. I must stand by my word. Marian Lindsay was the woman I had asked to marry me, whose answer I must shortly go to receive. If that answer were yes, I must accept the situation and banish all thought of Dorothy Armstrong's pretty face. Next evening at sunset I went to Glenwood, the Lindsay place. Doubtless an eager lover might have gone earlier, but an eager lover I certainly was not. Probably Marian was expecting me and had given orders concerning me, for the maid who came to the door conveyed me to a little room behind the stairs, a room which, as I felt as soon as I entered it, was a woman's pet domain. In its books and pictures and flowers it spoke eloquently of dainty femininity. Somehow it suited the letters. I did not feel quite so much the stranger as I had felt. Nevertheless, when I heard a light footfall on the stairs my heart beat painfully. I stood up and turned to the door, but I could not look up. The footsteps came nearer. I knew that a white hand swept aside the portiere at the entrance. I knew that she had entered the room and was standing before me. With an effort I raised my eyes and looked at her. She stood tall and gracious, in a ruby splendour of sunset falling through the window beside her. The light quivered like living radiance over a dark proud head, a white throat, and a face before whose perfect loveliness the memory of Dorothy Armstrong's laughing prettiness faded like a star in the sunrise, never more in the fullness of the day to be remembered. Yet it was not of her beauty I thought as I stood spellbound before her. I seemed to see a dim little valley full of whispering pines, and a girl standing under their shadows, looking at me with the same great, grayish blue eyes which gazed upon me now from Marian Lindsay's face. The same face, matured into gracious womanhood, that I had seen 10 years ago, and loved, aye, loved, ever since. I took an unsteady step forward. "Marian," I said. When I got home that night I burned Dorothy Armstrong's photograph. The next day I went to my cousin Tom, who owns the fashionable studio of Croyden, and binding him over to secrecy, sought one of Marian's latest photographs from him. It is the only secret I have ever kept from my wife. Before we were married Marian told me something. "I always remembered you as you looked that day under the pines," she said. "I was only a child, but I think I loved you then and ever afterwards. When I dreamed my girl's dream of love, your face rose up before me. I had the advantage of you that I knew your name. I had heard of you. When Peter wrote about you, I knew who you were. That was why I agreed to correspond with you. I was afraid it was a forward, an unwomanly thing to do, but it seemed my chance for happiness, and I took it. I'm glad I did. I did not answer in words, but lovers will know how I did answer. End of The Girl and the Photograph. The Gossip of Valley View. It was the 1st of April, and Julius Barrett, aged 14, perched on his father's gate-post, watched ruefully the low descending sun, and counted that day lost. He had not succeeded in fooling a single person, although he had tried repeatedly. One and all, old and young, of his intended victims had been too wary for Julius. Hence, Julius was disgusted and ready for anything in the way of a stratagem or a spoil. The Barrett gatepost topped the highest hill in Valley View. Julius could see the entire settlement, from young Thomas Everett's farm, a mile to the west, to Adelia Williams' weather-grey little house on a moonrise slope to the east. He was gazing moodily down the muddy road when Dan Chester, homeward bound from the post office, came riding sloppily along on his grey mare and pulled up by the Barrett gate to hand a paper to Julius. Dan was a young man who took life and himself very seriously. He seldom smiled, never joked, and had a Washingtonian reputation for veracity. Dan had never told a conscious falsehood in his life. He never even exaggerated. Julius, beholding Dan's solemn face, was seized with a perfectly irresistible desire to fool him. At the same moment his eye caught the dazzling reflection of the setting sun on the windows of Adelia Williams's house, and he had an inspiration little short of diabolical. "Have you heard the news, Dan?" he asked. "No, what news?" asked Dan. "I don't know's I ought to tell it," said Julius reflectively. "It's kind of a family affair. But then Adelia didn't say not to, and anyway, it'll be all over the place soon. So I'll tell you, Dan, if you'll promise never to tell who told you. Adelia Williams and young Thomas Everett are going to be married." Julius delivered himself of this tremendous lie with a transparently earnest countenance. Yet Dan, credulous as he was, could not believe it all at once. "Get out," he said. "It's true, 'pon my word," protested Julius. "Adelia was up last night and told Ma all about it. Ma's her cousin, you know. The wedding is to be in June, and Adelia asked Ma to help her get her quilts and things ready." Julius reeled all of this off so glibly that Dan finally believed the story, despite the fact that the people thus coupled together in prospective matrimony were the very last people in Valley View who could have been expected to marry each other. Young Thomas was a confirmed bachelor of 50, and Adelia Williams was 40. They were not supposed to be even well acquainted, as the Everetts and the Williamses had never been very friendly, although no open feud existed between them. Nevertheless, in view of Julius's circumstantial statements, the amazing news must be true, and Dan was instantly agog to carry it further. Julius watched Dan and the grey mare out of sight, fairly writhing with ecstasy. Oh, but Dan had been easy. The story would be all over Valley View in 24 hours. Julius laughed until he came near to falling off the gatepost. At this point Julius and Danny drop out of our story, and young Thomas enters. It was 2 days later when young Thomas heard that he was to be married to Adelia Williams in June. Eben Clark, the blacksmith, told him when he went to the forge to get his horse shod. Young Thomas laughed his big jolly laugh. Valley View gossip had been marrying him off for the last 30 years, although never before to Adelia Williams. "It's news to me," he said tolerantly. Eben grinned broadly. "Ah, you can't bluff it off like that, Tom," he said. "The news came too straight this time." "Well, I was glad to hear it, although I was mighty surprised. I never thought of you and Adelia, but she's a fine little woman and will make you a capital wife." Young Thomas grunted and drove away. He had a good deal of business to do that day, involving calls at various places: the store for molasses, the mill for flour, Jim Bentley's for seed grain, the doctor's for toothache drops for his housekeeper, the post office for mail, and at each and every place he was joked about his approaching marriage. In the end it rather annoyed Young Thomas. He drove home at last in what was for him something of a temper. How on earth had this fool story started? With such detailed circumstantiality of rugs and quilts, too. Adelia Williams must be going to marry somebody, and the Valley View gossips, unable to locate the man, had guessed Young Thomas. When he reached home, tired, muddy bespattered, and hungry, his housekeeper, who was also his hired man's wife, asked him if it was true that he was going to be married. Young Thomas, taking it at a glance, the ill-prepared, half-cold supper on the table, felt more annoyed than ever, and said it wasn't, with a strong expression. Not quite an oath, for Young Thomas never swore, unless swearing be as much a matter of intonation as of words. Mrs. Dunn sighed, patted her swelled face, and said she was sorry. She had hoped it was true, for her man had decided to go west. They were to go in a month's time. Young Thomas sat down to his supper with the prospect of having to look up another housekeeper and hired man before planting, to destroy his appetite. Next day 3 people who came to see Young Thomas on business congratulated him on his approaching marriage. Young Thomas, who had recovered his usual good humour, merely laughed. There was no use in being too earnest in denial, he thought. He knew that his usual fit of petulance with his housekeeper had only convinced her that the story was true. It would die away in time, as other similar stories had died, he thought. Valley View gossip was imaginative. Young Thomas looked rather serious, however, when the minister and his wife called that evening and referred to the report. Young Thomas gravely said that it was unfounded. The minister looked graver still, and said he was sorry. He had hoped it was true. His wife glanced significantly about Young Thomas's big, untidy sitting room, where there were cobwebs on the ceiling and fluff in the corners, and dust on the mop-board, and said nothing, but looked volumes. "Dang it all," said Young Thomas as they drove away. "They'll marry me yet in spite of myself." The gossip made him think about Adelia Williams. He had never thought about her before. He was barely acquainted with her. Now he remembered that she was a plump, jolly-looking little woman, noted for being a good housekeeper. Then Young Thomas groaned, remembering that he must start out looking for a housekeeper soon, and the housekeepers were not easily found, as Young Thomas had discovered several times since his mother's death 10 years before. Next Sunday in church, Young Thomas looked at Adelia Williams. He caught Adelia looking at him. Adelia blushed and looked guiltily away. "Dang it all," reflected Young Thomas, forgetting that he was in church. "I suppose she had heard that fool story too. I'd like to know the person who started it. Man or woman, I'd punch their head." Nevertheless, Young Thomas went on looking at Adelia, by fits and starts, although he did not again catch Adelia looking at him. He noticed that she had round, rosy cheeks and twinkling brown eyes. She did not look like an old maid, and Young Thomas wondered that she had been allowed to become one. Sarah Barnett, now, to whom report had married him a year ago, looked like a dried sour apple. For the next 4 weeks the story haunted Young Thomas like a spectre. Down it would not. Everywhere he went he was joked about it. It gathered fresh detail every week. Adelia was getting her clothes ready. She was to be married in seal brown cashmere. Vinnie Lawrence at Valley Centre was making it for her. She had got a new hat with a long ostrich plume. Some said white, some said gray. Young Thomas kept wondering who the man could be, for he was convinced that Adelia was going to marry somebody. More than that, once he caught himself wondering enviously. Adelia was a nice-looking woman, and he had not so far heard of any probable housekeeper. "Dang it all," said Young Thomas to himself in desperation. "I wouldn't care if it was true." His married sister from Carlisle heard the story and came over to investigate. Young Thomas denied it shortly, and his sister scolded. She had devoutly hoped it was true, she said, and it would have been a great weight off her mind. "This house is in a disgraceful condition, Thomas," she said severely. "It would break Mother's heart if she could rise out of her grave to see it. And Adelia Williams is a perfect housekeeper." "You didn't used to think so much of the Williams crowd," said Young Thomas dryly. "Oh, some of them don't amount to much," admitted Maria, "but Adelia's all right." Catching sight of an odd look on Young Thomas's face, she added hastily, "Thomas Everett, I believe it's true after all. Now is it? For mercy's sake don't be so sly. You might tell me, your own and only sister, if it is." "Oh, shut up," was Young Thomas's unfeeling reply to his own and only sister. Young Thomas told himself that night that Valley View gossip would drive him into an asylum yet if it didn't let up. He also wondered if Adelia was as much persecuted as himself. No doubt she was. He never could catch her eye in church now, but he would have been surprised had he realized how many times he tried to. The climax came the third week in May, when Young Thomas, who had been keeping house for himself for 3 weeks, received a letter and an express box from his cousin, Charles Everett, out in Manitoba. Charles and he had been chums in their boyhood. They corresponded occasionally still, although it was 20 years since Charles had gone west. The letter was to congratulate Young Thomas on his approaching marriage. Charles had heard of it through some Valley View correspondence of his wife. He was much pleased. He had always liked Adelia, he said. Had been an old beau of hers, in fact. Thomas might give her a kiss for him, if he liked. He forwarded a wedding present by express and hoped they would be very happy, etc. The present was an elaborate hat rack of polished buffalo horns, mounted on red plush with an inset mirror. Young Thomas set it up on the kitchen table and scowled moodily at his reflection in the mirror. If wedding presents were beginning to come, it was high time something was done. The matter was past being a joke. This affair of the present would certainly get out. Things always got out in Valley View, dang it all, and he would never hear the last of it. "I'll marry," said Young Thomas decisively. "If Adelia Williams won't have me, I'll marry the first woman who will, if it's Sarah Barnett herself." Young Thomas shaved and put on his Sunday suit. As soon as it was safely dark, he hied him away to Adelia Williams. He felt very doubtful about his reception, but the remembrance of the twinkle in Adelia's brown eye comforted him. She looked like a woman who had a sense of humour. She might not take him, but she would not feel offended or insulted because he asked her. "Dang it all, though, I hope she will take me," said Young Thomas. "I'm in for getting married now and no mistake, and I can't get Adelia out of my head. I've been thinking of her steady ever since that confounded gossip began." When he knocked at Adelia's door he discovered that his face was wet with perspiration. Adelia opened the door and started when she saw him. Then she turned very red and stiffly asked him in. Young Thomas went in and sat down, wondering if all men felt so horribly uncomfortable when they went courting. Adelia stooped low over the wood box to put a stick of wood in the stove, for the May evening was chilling. Her shoulders were shaking. The shaking grew worse. Suddenly Adelia laughed hysterically, and sitting down on the wood box continued to laugh. Young Thomas eyed her with a friendly grin. "Oh, do excuse me," gasped poor Adelia, wiping tears from her eyes. "This is dreadful. I didn't mean to laugh. I don't know why I'm laughing, but I can't help it." She laughed helplessly again. Young Thomas laughed too. His embarrassment vanished in the mellowness of that laughter. Presently Adelia composed herself and removed from the wood box to a chair, but there was still a suspicious twitching about the corners of her mouth. "I suppose," said Young Thomas, determined to have it over with before the ice could form again, "I suppose, Adelia, you've heard the story that's been going about you and me of late." Adelia nodded. "I've been persecuted to the verge of insanity with it," she said. "Every soul I've seen has tormented me about it, and people have written me about it. I've denied it till I was black in the face, but nobody believed me. I can't find out how it started. I hope you believe, Mr. Everett, that it couldn't possibly have arisen from anything I said. I've felt dreadfully worried for fear you might think it did. I heard that my cousin Lucilla Barrett said I told her, but Lucilla vowed to me that she never said such a thing or even dreamed of it. I've felt dreadful bad over the whole affair. I even gave up the idea of making a quilt after a lovely new pattern I've got because they made such a talk about my brown dress. I've been kind of supposing that you must be going to marry somebody, and folks just guessed it was me," said Young Thomas. He said it anxiously. "No, I'm not going to be married to anybody," said Adelia with a laugh, taking up her knitting. "I'm glad of that," said Young Thomas gravely. "I mean," he hastened to add, seeing the look of astonishment on Adelia's face, "that I'm glad there isn't any other man, because Because I want you myself, Adelia." Adelia laid down her knitting and blushed crimson, but she looked at Young Thomas squarely and reproachfully. "You needn't think you're bound to say that because of the gossip, Mr. Everett," she said quietly. "Oh, I don't," said Young Thomas earnestly. "But the truth is the story set me to thinking about you, and from that I got to wishing it was true. Honest, I did. I couldn't get you out of my head, and at last I didn't want to. It just seemed to me that you were the very woman for me if you'd only take me. Will you, Adelia? I've got a good farm and house, and I'll try to make you happy." It was not a very romantic wooing, perhaps, but Adelia was 40 and had never been a romantic little body even in the heyday of youth. She was a practical woman, and Young Thomas was a fine-looking man of his age with abundance of worldly goods. Besides, she liked him, and the gossip had made her think a good deal about him of late. Indeed, in a moment of candour she had owned to herself the very last Sunday in church that she wouldn't mind if the story were true. "I'll think of it," she said. This was practically an acceptance, and Young Thomas so understood it. Without loss of time he crossed the kitchen, sat down beside Adelia, and put his arms about her plump waist. "Here's a kiss Charlie sent me to give you," he said, giving it. End of The Gossip of Valley View. The Letters. Just before the letter was brought to me that evening, I was watching the red November sunset from the library window. It was a stormy, unrestful sunset, gleaming angrily through the dark fir boughs that were now and again tossed suddenly and distressfully in a fitful gust of wind. Below in the garden it was quite dark, and I could only see dimly the dead leaves that were whirling and dancing uncannily over the roseless paths. The poor dead leaves, yet not quite dead. There was still enough unquiet life left in them to make them restless and forlorn. They hearkened yet to every call of the wind, who cared for them no longer, but only played freakishly with them and broke their rest. I felt sorry for the leaves as I watched them in that dull, weird twilight, and angry in a petulant fashion that almost made me laugh, with the wind that would not leave them in peace. Why should they, and I, be vexed with these transient breaths of desire for a life that had passed us by? I was in the grip of a bitter loneliness that evening, so bitter and so insistent that I felt I could not face the future at all, even with such poor fragments of courage as I had gathered about me after Father's death, hoping that they would at least suffice for my endurance, if not for my content. But now they fell away from me at sight of the emptiness of life. The emptiness! Ah, it was from that I shrank. I could have faced pain and anxiety and heartbreak undauntedly, but I could not face that terrible, yawning, barren emptiness. I put my hands over my eyes to shut it out, but it pressed in upon my consciousness insistently and would not be ignored longer. The moment when a woman realizes that she has nothing to live for, neither love, nor purpose, nor duty, holds for her the bitterness of death. She is a brave woman indeed who can look upon such a prospect unquailingly, and I was not brave. I was weak and timid. Had not Father often laughed mockingly at me because of it? It was 3 weeks since Father had died, my proud, handsome, unrelenting old father, whom I had loved so intensely, and who had never loved me. I had always accepted this fact unresentfully and unquestioningly, but it had steeped my whole life in its tincture of bitterness. Father had never forgiven me for 2 things. I had cost my mother's life, and I was not a son to perpetuate the old name and carry on the family feud with the Frasers. I was a very lonely child, with no playmates or companions of any sort, and my girlhood was lonelier still. The only passion in my life was my love for my father. I would have done and suffered anything to win his affection in return, but all I ever did win was an amused tolerance, and I was grateful for that, almost content. It was much to have something to love and be permitted to love it. If I had been a beautiful and spirited girl, I think Father might have loved me, but I was neither. At first I did not think or care about my lack of beauty. Then one day I was alone in the beech wood. I was trying to disentangle my skirt, which had caught on some thorny underbrush. A young man came around the curve of the path, and seeing my predicament, bent with murmured apology to help me. He had to kneel to do it, and I saw a ray of sunshine falling through the beeches above us, strike like a lance of light athwart the thick brown hair that pushed out from under his cap. Before I thought, I put out my hand and touched it softly. Then I blushed crimson with shame over what I had done. But he did not know. He never knew. When he had released my dress, he rose, and our eyes met for a moment as I timidly thanked him. I saw that he was good to look upon, tall and straight, with broad, stalwart shoulders and dark, clean-cut face. He had a firm, sensitive mouth and kindly, pleasant, dark blue eyes. I never quite forgot the look in those eyes. It made my heart beat strangely, but it was only for a moment, and the next he had lifted his cap and passed on. As I went homeward, I wondered who he might be. He must be a stranger, I thought, probably a visitor in some of our few neighbouring families. I wondered, too, if I should meet him again, and found the thought very pleasant. I knew few men, and they were all old like Father, or at least elderly. They were the only people who ever came to our house, and they either teased me or overlooked me. None of them was at all like this young man I had met in the beech wood, nor ever could have been, I thought. When I reached home, I stopped before the big mirror that hung in the hall and did what I had never done before in my life, looked at myself very scrutinizingly and wondered if I had any beauty. I could only sorrowfully conclude that I had not. I was so slight and pale, and the thick black hair and dark eyes that might have been pretty in another woman seemed only to accentuate the lack of spirit and regularity in my features. I was still standing there, gazing wistfully at my mirrored face, with a strange sinking of spirit, when Father came through the hall, his riding whip in his hand. Seeing me, he laughed. "Don't waste your time gazing into mirrors, Isabel," he said carelessly. "That might have been excusable in former ladies of Shirley, whose beauty might pardon and even adorn vanity, but with you it is only absurd. The needle and the cookbook are all that you need concern yourself with." I was accustomed to such speeches from him, but they had never hurt me so cruelly before. At that moment I would have given all the world only to be beautiful. The next Sunday I looked across the church, and in the Fraser pew I saw the young man I had met in the wood. He was looking at me with his arms folded over his breast, and on his brow a little frown that seemed somehow indicative of pain and surprise. I felt a miserable sense of disappointment. If he were the Frasers' guest, I could not expect to meet him again. Father hated the Frasers. All the Shirleys hated them. It was an old feud, bitter and lasting, that had been as much our inheritance for generations as land and money. The only thing Father had ever taken pains to teach me was detestation of the Frasers and all their works. I accepted this as I accepted all the other traditions of my race. I thought it did not matter much. The Frasers were not likely to come my way, and hatred was a good satisfying passion in the lack of all else. I think I rather took a pride in hating them, as became my blood. I did not look at the Fraser pew again, but outside under the elms we met him, standing in the dappling light and shadow. He looked very handsome and a little sad. I could not help glancing back over my shoulder as Father and I walked to the gate, and I saw him looking after us with that little frown which again made me think something had hurt him. I liked better the smile he had worn in the beech wood, but I had an odd liking for the frown too, and I think I had a foolish longing to go back to him, put up my fingers and smooth it away. "So Alan Fraser had come home," said my father. "Alan Fraser?" I repeated, with a strange, horrible feeling of coldness and chill coming over me, like a shadow on a bright day. Alan Fraser, the son of old Malcolm Fraser of Glenellyn, the son of our enemy. He had been living since childhood with his dead mother's people, so much I knew, and this was he. Something stung and smarted in my eyes. I think the sting and smart might have turned to tears if Father had not been looking down at me. "Yes, didn't you see him in his father's pew? But I forgot. You are too demure to be looking at the young men and preaching, or out of it, Isabel. You are a model young woman. Odd that the men never like the model young women. Curse old Malcolm Fraser. What right has he to have a son like that when I have nothing but a puling girl? Remember, Isabel, that if you ever meet that young man you are not to speak to or look at him, or even intimate that you are aware of his existence. He is your enemy and the enemy of your race. You will show him that you realize this." Of course that ended it all, though just what there had been to end would have been hard to say. Not long afterwards I met Alan Fraser again, when I was out for a canter on my mare. He was strolling through the beechwood with a couple of big collies, and he stopped short as I drew near. I had to do it. Father had decreed. My Shirley pride demanded that I should do it. I looked him unseeingly in the face, struck my mare a blow with my whip, and dashed past him. I even felt angry. I think that a Fraser should have the power to make me feel so badly in doing my duty. After that I had forgotten. There was nothing to make me remember, for I never met Alan Fraser again. The years slipped by one, so like each other in their colourlessness that I forgot to take account of them. I only knew that I grew older, and that it did not matter, since there was nobody to care. One day they brought Father in, white-lipped and groaning. His mare had thrown him, and he was never to walk again, although he lived for 5 years. Those 5 years had been the happiest of my life. For the first time I was necessary to someone. There was something for me to do which nobody else could do so well. I was Father's nurse and companion, and I found my pleasure in tending him and amusing him, soothing his hours of pain and brightening his hours of ease. People said I did my duty toward him. I had never liked that word duty since the day I had ridden past Alan Fraser in the beechwood. I could not connect it with what I did for Father. It was my delight because I loved him. I did not mind the moods and the irritable outbursts that drove others from him. But now he was dead, and I sat in the sullen dusk wishing that I need not go on with life either. The loneliness of the big echoing house weighed on my spirit. I was solitary, without companionship. I looked out on the outside world where the only sign of human habitation visible to my eye was the light twinkling out from the library window of Glenellyn on the dark fir hills 2 miles away. By that light I knew Alan Fraser must have returned from his long sojourn abroad, for it only shone when he was at Glenellyn. He still lived there. Something of a hermit, people said. He had never married, and he cared nothing for society. His companions were books and dogs and horses. He was given to scientific researches and wrote much for the reviews. He travelled a great deal. So much I knew in a vague way. I even saw him occasionally in church, and never thought the years had changed him much, save that his face was sadder and sterner than of old, and his hair had become iron grey. People said that he had inherited and cherished the old hatred of the Shirleys, that he was very bitter against us. I believed it. He had the face of a good hater, or lover, a man who could play with no emotion but must take it in all earnestness and intensity. When it was quite dark, the housekeeper brought in the lights and handed me a letter, which she said a man had just brought up from the village post office. I looked at it curiously before I opened it, wondering from whom it was. It was postmarked from a city several miles away, and the firm decided, rather peculiar handwriting was strange to me. I had no correspondence. After Father's death I had received a few perfunctory notes of condolence from distant relatives and family friends. They had hurt me cruelly, for they seemed to exhale a subtle spirit of congratulation on my being released from a long and unpleasant martyrdom of attendance on an invalid, that quite overrode the decorous phrases of conventional sympathy in which they were expressed. I hated those letters for their implied injustice. I was not thankful for my release. I missed Father miserably, and longed passionately for the very tasks and vigils that had evoked their pity. This letter did not seem like one of those. I opened it and took out some stiff, blackly written sheets. They were undated, and turning to the last I saw that they were unsigned. With a not unpleasant tingling of interest I sat down by my desk to read. The letter began abruptly. "You will not know by whom this is written. Do not seek to know, now or ever. It is only from behind the veil of your ignorance of my identity that I can ever write to you fully and freely as I wish to write, can say what I wish to say in words denied to a formal and conventional expression of sympathy. Dear lady, let me say to you thus what is in my heart. I know what your sorrow is, and I think I know what your loneliness must be. The sorrow of a broken tie, the loneliness of a life thrown emptily back on itself. I know how you loved your father, how you must have loved him if those eyes and brow and mouth speak truth, for they tell of a nature divinely rich and deep, giving of its wealth and tenderness ungrudgingly to those who are so happy as to be of the object of its affection. To such a nature bereavement must bring a depth and an agony of grief unknown to shallower souls. I know what your father's helplessness and need of you meant to you. I know that now life must seem to you a broken and embittered thing, and knowing this, I venture to send this greeting across the gulf of strangerhood between us, telling you that my understanding sympathy is fully and freely yours, and bidding you take heart for the future, which now, it may be, looks so heartless and hopeless to you. Believe me, dear lady, it will be neither. Courage will come to you with the kind days. You will find noble tasks to do, beautiful and gracious duties waiting along your path. The pain and suffering of the world never dies, and while it lives there will be work for such as you to do, and in the doing of it you will find comfort and strength and the highest joy of living. I believe in you. I believe you will make of your life a beautiful and worthy thing. I give you Godspeed for the years to come. Out of my own loneliness, I, an unknown friend, who has never clasped your hand, send this message to you. I understand. I have always understood. And I say to you, be of good cheer. To say that this strange letter was a mystery to me seems an inadequate way of stating the matter. I was completely bewildered, nor could I even guess who the writer might be, think and ponder as I might. The letter itself implied that the writer was a stranger. The handwriting was evidently that of a man, and I knew no man who could or would have sent out such a letter to me. The very mystery stung me to interest. As for the letter itself, it brought me an uplift of hope and inspiration such as I would not have believed possible an hour earlier. It rang so truly and sincerely, and the mere thought that somewhere I had a friend who cared enough to write it, even in such odd fashion, was so sweet that I was half ashamed of the difference it made in my outlook. Sitting there, I took courage and made a compact with myself that I would justify the writer's faith in me, that I would take up my life as something to be worthy lived for all good, to the disregard of my own selfish sorrow and shrinking. I would seek for something to do, for interests which would bind me to my fellow creatures, for tasks which would lessen the pains and perils of humankind. An hour before this would not have seemed to me possible. Now it seemed the right and natural thing to do. A week later another letter came. I welcomed it with an eagerness which I feared was almost childish. It was a much longer letter than the first and was written in quite a different strain. There was no apology for or explanation of the motive for writing. It was as if the letter were merely one of a permitted and established correspondence between old friends. It began with a witty, sparkling review of a new book the writer had just read, and passed from this to crisp comments on great events, political, scientific, artistic, of the day. The whole letter was pungent, interesting, delightful, an impersonal essay on a dozen vital topics of life and thought. Only at the end was a personal note struck. "Are you interested in these things?" ran the last paragraph. "In what is being done and suffered and attained in the great busy world? I think you must be, for I've seen you and read what is written in your face. I believe you care for these things as I do, that your being thrills to the still, sad music of humanity, that the songs of the poets I love find an echo in your spirit, and the aspirations of all struggling souls a sympathy in your heart. Believing this, I have written freely to you, taking a keen pleasure in thus revealing my thoughts and visions to one who will understand. For I, too, am friendless, in the sense of one standing alone, shut out from the sweet, intimate communion of feeling and opinion that may be held with the heart's friends. Shall you have read this as a friend, I wonder, a candid, uncritical, understanding friend? Let me hope it, dear lady." I was expecting the third letter when it came, but not until it did come did I realize what my disappointment would have been if it had not. After that every week brought me a letter. Soon those letters were the greatest interest in my life. I had given up all attempts to solve the mystery of their coming, and was content to enjoy them for themselves alone. From week to week I looked forward to them with an eagerness that I would hardly confess even to myself. And such letters as they were, growing longer and fuller and freer as time went on, such wise, witty, brilliant, pungent letters, stimulating all my torpid life into tingling zest. I had begun to look abroad, in my small world, for worthy work, and found plenty to do. My unknown friend evidently kept track of my expanding efforts, for he commented and criticized, encouraged and advised freely. There was a humour in his letters that I liked. It leavened them with its sanity and reacted on me most wholesomely, counteracting many of the morbid tendencies and influences of my life. I found myself striving to live up to the writer's ideal of philosophy and ambition, as pictured often unconsciously in his letters. They were an intellectual stimulant as well. To understand them fully I found it necessary to acquaint myself thoroughly with the literature and art, the science and the politics they touched upon. After every letter there was something new for me to hunt out and learn and assimilate, until my old narrow mental attitude had so broadened and deepened, sweeping out into circles of thought I had never known or imagined, that I hardly knew myself. They had been coming for a year before I began to reply to them. I had often wished to do so. There were so many things I wanted to say and discuss, but it seemed foolish to write letters that could not be sent. One day a letter came that kindled my imagination and stirred my heart and soul so deeply that they insistently demanded answering expression. I sat down at my desk and wrote a full reply to it, safe in the belief that the mysterious friend to whom it was written would never see it. I wrote with a perfect freedom and a total lack of self-consciousness that I could never have attained otherwise. The writing of that letter gave me a pleasure second only to that which the reading of his brought. For the first time I discovered the delight of revealing my thoughts unhindered by the conventions. Also, I understood better why the writer of those letters had written them. Doubtless he had enjoyed doing so and was not impelled thereto simply by a purely philanthropic wish to help me. When my letter was finished I sealed it up and locked it away in my desk, with a smile at my middle-aged folly. What, I wondered, would all my sedate, serious friends, my associates of mission and hospital committees, think if they knew? Well, everybody has or should have a pet nonsense in their life. I did not think mine was any sillier than some others I knew, and to myself I admitted that it was very sweet. I knew if those letters ceased to come, all savour would go out of my life. After that I wrote a reply to every letter I received and kept them all locked up together. It was delightful. I wrote out all my doings and perplexities and hopes and plans and wishes, yes, and my dreams. The secret romance of it all made me look on existence with joyous, contented eyes. Gradually a change crept over the letters I received. Without ever affording the slightest clue to the identity of their writer, they grew more intimate and personal. A subtle, caressing note of tenderness breathed from them and thrilled my heart curiously. I felt as if I were being drawn into the writer's life, admitted into the most sacred recesses of his thoughts and feelings. Yet it was all done so subtly, so delicately, that I was unconscious of the change until I discovered it in reading over the older letters and comparing them with the later ones. Finally a letter came. My first love letter, and surely never was a love letter received under stranger circumstances. It began abruptly as all the letters had begun, plunging into the middle of the writer's strain of thought without any preface. The first words drove the blood to my heart and then sent it flying hotly all over my face. I love you. I must say it at last. Have you not guessed it before? It has trembled on my pen in every line I have written to you, yet I have never dared to shape it into words before. I know not how I dare now. I only know that I must. What a delight to write it out and know that you will read it. Tonight the mood is on me to tell it to you recklessly and lavishly, never pausing to stint or weigh words. Sweetheart, I love you, love you, love you. Dear, true, faithful woman soul, I love you with all the heart of a man. Ever since I first saw you, I have loved you. I can never come to tell you so in spoken words. I can only love you from afar and tell my love under the guise of impersonal friendship. It matters not to you, but it matters more than all else in life to me. I am glad that I love you, dear. Glad, glad, glad. There was much more, for it was a long letter. When I had read it, I buried my burning face in my hands, trembling with happiness. This strange confession of love meant so much to me. My heart leaped forth to meet it with answering love. What mattered it that we could never meet? that I could not even guess who my lover was. Somewhere in the world was a love that was mine alone, and mine wholly, and mine forever. What mattered his name or his station, or the mysterious barrier between us? Spirit leaped to spirit unhindered over the fettering bounds of matter and time. I loved and was beloved. Nothing else mattered. I wrote my answer to his letter. I wrote it fearlessly and unstintedly. Perhaps I could not have written so freely if the letter were to have been read by him. As it was, I poured out the riches of my love as fully as he had done. I kept nothing back, and across the gulf between us I vowed a faithful and enduring love in response to his. The next day I went to town on business with my lawyers. Neither of the members of the firm was in when I called, but I was an old client, and one of the clerks showed me into the private office to wait. As I sat down, my eyes fell on a folded letter lying on the table beside me. With a shock of surprise, I recognized the writing. I could not be mistaken. I should have recognized it anywhere. The letter was lying by its envelope, so folded that only the middle third of the page was visible. An irresistible impulse swept over me. Before I could reflect that I had no business to touch the letter, that perhaps it was unfair to my unknown friend to seek to discover his identity when he wished to hide it, I had turned the letter over and seen the signature. I laid it down again and stood up, dizzy, breathless, unseen. Like a woman in a dream, I walked through the outer office and into the street. I must have walked on for blocks before I became conscious of my surroundings. The name I had seen signed to that letter was Alan Fraser. No doubt the reader has long ago guessed it, has wondered why I had not. The fact remains that I had not. Out of the whole world, Alan Fraser was the last man whom I should have suspected to be the writer of those letters. Alan Fraser, my hereditary enemy, who I had been told cherished the old feud so faithfully and bitterly, and hated our very name. And yet I now wondered at my long blindness. No one else could have written those letters. No one but him. I read them over one by one when I reached home, and now that I possessed the key, he revealed himself in every line, expression, and thought. And he loved me. I thought of the old feud and hatred. I thought of my pride and traditions. They seemed like the dust and ashes of outworn things, things to be smiled at and cast aside. I took out all the letters I had written, all except the last one, sealed them up in a parcel, and directed it to Alan Fraser. Then, summoning my groom, I bade him ride to Glen Ellen with it. His look of amazement almost made me laugh, but after he was gone I felt dizzy and frightened at my own daring. When the autumn darkness came down, I went to my room and dressed as the woman dresses who awaits the one man of all the world. I hardly knew what I hoped or expected, but I was all athrill with the nameless, inexplicable happiness. I admit I looked very eagerly into the mirror when I was done, and I thought that the result was not unpleasing. Beauty had never been mine, but a faint reflection of it came over me in the tremulous flush and excitement of the moment. Then the maid came up to tell me that Alan Fraser was in the library. I went down with my cold hands tightly clasped behind me. He was standing by the library table, a tall, broad-shouldered man, with the light striking upward on his dark, sensitive face and iron-grey hair. When he saw me, he came quickly forward. "So you know, and you're not angry? Your letters told me so much. I have loved you since that day in the beechwood, Isabel. Isabel." His eyes were kindling into mine. He held my hands in a close, impetuous clasp. His voice was infinitely caressing as he pronounced my name. I had never heard it since Father died. I had never heard it at all so musically and tenderly uttered. My ancestors might have turned in their graves just then, but it mattered not. Living love had driven out dead hatred. "Isabel," he went on, "there was one letter unanswered, the last." I went to my desk, took out the last letter I had written, and gave it to him in silence. While he read it, I stood in a shadowy corner and watched him, wondering if life could always be as sweet as this. When he had finished, he turned to me and held out his arms. I went to them as a bird to her nest, and with his lips against mine, the old feud was blotted out forever. End of The Letters.